From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $77 million studio on the Pro Wrestlemania. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestlemania. April 12, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Wrestlemania 15 business numbers, details on All Japan's Tokyo Dome show, plus tons more. By Observer staff. Here are the Wrestlemania 15 final poll results. Thumbs up, 156 votes, 50.2% thumbs down, 92 votes, 29.6% in the middle, 63 votes, 20.3% in the best match poll. It seems like fans really love the Steve Austin vs. Rock match, with 214 votes. Other notable mentions include Butterbean vs. Bart Gunn with 19 votes and Shane McMahon vs. X-Pac with 14 votes. On the flip side, the worst match poll highlighted that Undertaker vs. Big Boss Man didn't quite hit the mark, getting 120 votes as the worst match. Sable vs. Tori also received criticism with 112 votes. These results are based on phone calls, letters, and fax messages to the Observer as of Tuesday, April 6. Please note that there is a statistical margin of error of approximately plus-minus 100%. Both Davey Boy Smith and Japanese rookie woman wrestler Emiko Kato were both remaining in bad condition after an illness and in-ring injury respectively. Smith, 36, is suffering from an undiagnosed infection in the spine, which could be a staph infection, and as of last reports late on April 5, was in intensive care at Rocky View Hospital in Calgary. It's been a harrowing period for Smith, whose sister Tracy died of cancer in November and his mother died of cancer in February, and when he took ill a few weeks back was sure he was the next in line. Smith had been crippled in recent weeks with both back and abdominal pains and had dropped 40 pounds, but tests determined he didn't have cancer, although doctors are stumped as to exactly what he has. Smith's back hasn't been the same since being slammed on the trapdoor on a Nitro taping when Warrior was working for the company. On March 29, Smith's daughter noticed a large lump on his back and he was taken to the hospital when doctors determined the lump was a bone infection, which was spreading through his body. Doctors at the time prescribed aggressive antibiotics as treatment, but after tests on March 31, the doctors determined the initial treatments weren't working and increased the dosages. Smith's physician, Dr. Ronald Lim, suspected it was a staph infection of the spine and that it isn't life-threatening. Lim said that Smith would be hospitalized for a minimum of 6 weeks and said it was too early to know whether or not he would ever be able to return to wrestling, but said he's out a minimum of 4 months. Later in the week, as his pain, described as the feeling of having a knife in the back 24 hours a day, worsened, the estimates were that he would be hospitalized closer to 3 months. Smith, who is still under contract to WCW despite rumors to the contrary, but hasn't worked in months, has seen his career take a major turn for the worst after his back and knee problems, probably the culmination of 20 years in the ring, with the problems really taking their toll dating back to the summer of 1997. Kato, 23, who had only been wrestling for 6 weeks, remained in a coma as of April 6 in a Fukuoka hospital after apparently taking a bump wrong in a match on March 31 and undergoing brain surgery the next day. Details are very sketchy, as it was a small show in Fukuoka and the promotion itself has been very quiet about giving details. Kato was in a tag match with Michiko Omukai against Mariko Yoshida and Mikiko Futagami and was pinned to end the match. She never got up. The wrestlers attempted to revive her to no avail, and she was rushed to the hospital and cut on, but even though the surgery was called successful, she has remained in a coma ever since. Kato started training with urgent to be a pro wrestler this past June, and had her first match on February 16 against Asia Kong and had a few bouts since that time, with this being her first tour. The situation brought a reminder to the death of Plum Mariko Umeda on August 16, 1997 from a brain aneurysm after suffering several concussions in the ring. After Mariko's death, there was a lot of media talk about mandating doctors at ringside for pro wrestling matches, which is the case in some states in the US but not most anymore, but isn't the case in Japan. Based on early estimates, Wrestlemania 15, billed by the WWF as the most watched and greatest WrestleMania ever, will be the biggest money pay-per-view pro wrestling show in history. Early estimates are a 2.23 buy rate, which totals 830,000 buys, which would be an approximately $12.47 million company gross. The buy rate would be basically the same as last year's show according to our figures. It would actually be slightly lower than last year, which did a 2.3, but with the number of homes with pay-per-view capability having grown by several million over the past year, the number of buys increased from approximately 720,000, which is believed to be the previous high watermark for a pro wrestling pay-per-view show. The show will no doubt be significantly more profitable than last year as well because there is no $3.5 million price tag for Mike Tyson cutting into the final bottom line, and I'd guess more corporate sponsorship and less money spent on celebrity guests. In the late 80s/early 90s, WWF often claimed 900,000 buys for its WrestleMania shows, but nowadays the company is claiming last year's version as the all-time high before this year's show happened, and the numbers released in the past for shows in that era were greatly inflated. However, there is no way to put this show, in its proper perspective, as being ahead of the most famous and overall successful WrestleMania of all, number 3 from the Pontiac Silverdome. That show, besides selling the Silverdome out with that attendance figure that is quoted forever as the largest indoor sports crowd in history, but is it a sports event? Drew a buy rate billed at the time as 10.2% by the WWF, probably 8% is a more realistic figure, which is none too shabby considering I don't think anything short of Tyson versus Ali in their primes today could do a number close to that today, as Louis Holyfield legit did a 3.23 buy rate or 1,200,000 buys, and the promoter's cut of the pay-per-view gross was about $26 million. Hogan vs. Andre was about 500,000 buys, a larger buy rate than any event in history aside from a few major boxing matches, with a price tag at the time of $19.95 at a time when the pay-per-view universe was about 6 million homes. So while this year's showed at 830,000 buys, it did so when there are more than 37 million homes with pay-per-view capability. That WrestleMania also drew another 450,000 fans watching on closed-circuit television, so totaling all three purchase numbers, live attendance, pay-per-view and closed-circuit, you get more than 1 million for WrestleMania 3 and just under 850,000 this year, although realistically you can make a valid claim that more people watch this show live because you would think the average is a few people per home on pay-per-view. Whether the show was the best Mania ever is a matter of opinion, but it would be hard to rate it as even close, but calling it the best is standard annual operating procedure after the show. To me, of the 15 shows, the easy standout show was number 10, held in 1994 at Madison Square Garden, since it featured two of what would surely be considered the best matches ever on WWF pay-per-view, the Shawn Michaels vs. Razor Ramon ladder match and the Bret Hart vs. Owen Hart opening singles match. There were newspaper reports that the WWF failed to acquire both Howard Stern and Monica Lewinsky as special guests for the most recent show, with the New York Daily News reporting both turned down seven-figure offers. According to WWF officials, there was never any contact made with Lewinsky. The newspaper stories basically reported Lewinsky's people nixed it immediately, and that there were negotiations with Stern that didn't come to fruition. Stern turned them down after negotiating for several weeks, but the door was left open for a possible appearance sometime in the future. WrestleMania history. 1. March 31, 1985, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T vs. Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper. 2. April 5, 1986, Hogan vs. King Kong Bundy, 7.0 buy rate. 3. March 29, 1987, Hogan vs. Andre the Giant, 8.0 buy rate. 4. March 27, 1988, Savage wins WWF title tourney, 6.5 buy rate. 5. April 2, 1989, Hogan vs. Savage, 6.0 buy rate. 6. April 1, 1990, Hogan vs. Ultimate Warrior, 4.5 buy rate. 7. March 23, 1991, Hogan vs. Sergeant Slaughter, 3.5 buy rate. 8. April 5, 1992, Hogan vs. Sid Justice, 2.3 buy rate. 9. April 4, 1993, Bret Hart vs. Yokozuna, 2.0 buy rate. 10. March 20, 1994, Hart vs. Yokozuna, 1.68 buy rate. 11. April 2, 1995, Lawrence Taylor vs. Bam Bam Bigelow, 1.3 buy rate. 12. March 31, 1996, Hart vs. Shawn Michaels, 1.2 buy rate. 13. March 23, 1997, Undertaker vs. Sid, 0.77 buy rate. 14. March 29, 1998, Michaels vs. Steve Austin, 2.3 buy rate. Dave's pick of 10 greatest WrestleMania matches. 1. Michaels vs. Razor Ramon ladder match, WrestleMania 10-2. Bret Hart vs. Steve Austin, WrestleMania 13-3. Bret Hart vs. Owen Hart, WrestleMania 10-4. Ricky Steamboat vs. Savage, WrestleMania 3-5. Warrior vs. Savage, WrestleMania 7-6. Hart vs. Michaels, WrestleMania 12-7. British Bulldogs vs. Greg Valentine and Brutus Beefcake, WrestleMania 2-8. Ric Flair vs. Savage, WrestleMania 8-9. Hogan vs. Warrior, WrestleMania 6-10. Rock vs. Austin, WrestleMania 15. Any list of this type is highly subjective. I'd bet if you'd watch all these matches back now that Hogan vs. Warrior, as an example, wouldn't be in the top 30, but live the match was great. I can recall when they had one of Hellwig's returns that they showed the match on television and everyone was remarking just how slow it was and there was nothing to it but a few high spots and 16 minutes of rest holds in a 24 minutes match, but you have to judge things in their perspective. I hadn't watched that Warrior Savage match in 8 years, but I'd assume it wouldn't hold up as well today either, although I do remember it as being an incredible one-man show by Savage that day. Many of the classic matches of the 70s wouldn't look as great by today's standards and the classic matches of the 60s would look downright bad. But wrestling isn't meant to be viewed 20 years later. Actually, because the crowd heat was generally so much better in the 80s, which I attribute to a greater suspension of disbelief among the fans as compared with today, and that isn't knocking the current product because the soap opera obviously attracts people in a completely different way and is successful. The 80s American matches, even though they have less acrobatic moves and over-the-edge bumps, usually come across as more exciting than the best matches of the current product. All Japan is expected this week to officially announce the lineup for its second annual Tokyo Dome show on May 2nd, which is expected to break the all-time company attendance record of 58,300 set at last year's show. As mentioned last week, the main event will have Vader defending the Triple Crown against Mitsuharu Misawa. The remainder of the show will be Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama and Jinsei Shinzaki, who will wrestle with face and body paint using his full Hakushi gimmick, versus Johnny Ace and the Road Warriors, who are still regarded as 80s legends in Japan. Hiroshi Hashi versus Toshiaki Kawada, their first ever singles match, and both men's return to action after months off due to political duties and a broken arm respectively. Steve Williams and Stan Hansen and Akira Taue versus Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama and Takawa Mori, Yoshinari Ogawa and Monokia Mossman, and Masahito Kaihara versus Hayabusa and Great Sasuke and Tiger Mask 4, the latter two making their All Japan debuts. Johnny Smith and Tomoe Honda and Masa Fuchi versus Koji Nakagawa and Geto and Yukihiro Kanemura of FMW in an interpromotional match. Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momota and Masao Inoue versus Giant Kimala 2 and Haruka Eigen and Jun Izumida. Satoru Asako and Takeshi Morishima versus Kentaro Shigai and Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Masamichi Marufuji versus Grand Naniwa and Makoto Hashi. In addition, there will be what is being billed as the ceremonial retirement match for Giant Baba, who of course never had an official retirement match. It is billed as Baba and the Destroyer versus Bruno Sammartino and Gene Kiniski, although it'll actually be a ceremony honoring Baba hosted by Destroyer, Sammartino and Kiniski, which will be a pretty big deal because it will probably be the last time Sammartino, Destroyer or Kiniski appear in the ring at a pro wrestling show in Japan. All Japan was interested in booking the Road Warriors, Williams and Steve Austin on this show, but with WWF having major shows in Anaheim and San Diego over the weekend, plus, no doubt, Austin at this point would cost a huge booking fee and one would have to assume the show is going to sell out with or without him. It really would have been difficult to put it together. Unlike in the past when WWF wasn't really concerned about sending mid-level wrestlers to All Japan and do jobs, with the WWF at such a strong point, finishes were an issue even though Williams and the Warriors aren't headliners for Titan, and it is believed they will all be protected. As in they won't be the ones doing the jobs. When it comes to straight shoots, many of the most intriguing matches for this year will be taking place on 3 shows over the next month. Even though it appears it will have a worked main event, and without Hicks and Gracie, not the level of mainstream pub, there are a lot of insiders who think the Pride 5 show on April 29th in Nagoya could be the show of the year, and not for the Nobuhiko Takada vs. Mark Coleman match which is being counted on to sell the tickets. It appears to be the best undercard for a shoot show in a long time. Probably the most intriguing match of all is Kazushi Sakuraba, the former UWFI pro wrestler who has been unbeaten under MMA rules, including winning the single weirdest tournament in UFC history, since Kingdom folded it, and is very highly thought of by insiders as one of the best submission fighters in the world, facing Vitor Belfort, the Brazilian sensation with all the physical tools in the world but a suspect head. Belfort was all the rage while only 19 years old, destroying 4 much larger men in less than 80 seconds each with his amazing punching speed and power, not to mention radar-like accuracy, until running into Randy Couture on October 17, 1997, and being turned into a mere mortal and taking a pounding in defeat. After a lackluster performance in what was certainly a suspect fight with Joe Charles on the UFC show in Japan on December 21, 1997, Belfort's stock took a tumble as he several times switched trainers, canceled bookings, and didn't seem all that interested in fighting, frustrating everyone involved who believed he not only had potential to be one of the best, but the charisma and marketability because of the rapid manner he dispatched his foes. In his only appearance last year, on October 16, 1998 on the first UFC in Brazil, Belfort was scheduled against Wanderlei Silva, whom many thought would destroy the myth for good. Probably nobody was more concerned than Belfort, who pulled out of the fight several times in the days leading to the show, only to be talked back in because promoters realized how much he meant to the debut UFC show in Brazil. Although appearing underconfident, the result hardly bore that out as Belfort, in his most impressive performance of his career, destroyed Silva in 44 seconds with a barrage of 17 punches in 7 seconds. That performance seemed to turn a middleweight title match with Frank Shamrock into the UFC's first real potential marquee title match since the Ken Shamrock-Dan Severn era. But since that time, Belfort canceled out of a match with Guy Mesger, which wound up a blessing in disguise for UFC since it created Tito Ortiz as a new star, and hasn't fought since. The match is intriguing because Sakuraba can't hang with Belfort standing up. He is probably much better when it comes to submissions on the ground, although we've yet to see Belfort even tested on the ground yet. Can Sakuraba at 185 pounds take down Belfort, who rumor has it is closing in the 220-pound range again? And how will that added weight, if Belfort comes in like that, affect him, particularly if Sakuraba can survive the first onslaught of punches that nobody but Couture has survived to date? On paper, it seems to favor Belfort, but fights aren't fought on paper. The other big match is Mark Kerr, considered the man in heavyweight circles with a 10-0 record and who has never even been physically tested, and coming off the tournament win in Abu Dhabi in the World Submissions Championship, facing Enson Inoue, the heavyweight champion from Shudo, whose last MMA match was a submission win over formerly unbeaten Couture. Where Inoue is dangerous is that in 2 fights against world-class wrestlers, the other being Royce Alger at a UFC show in 1997, he submitted both, with lightning-like armbars in about 90 seconds. Kerr is a world-class wrestler, but has studied submission avoidance and has never been close to being in trouble against many submission experts. Inoue has 3 losses, a loss early in his career against a basically unknown fighter that he avenged later, and 2 knockout losses to Igor Zinoviev and Frank Shamrock. Kerr is not the skilled striker that Zinoviev or Shamrock are, but is a much physically larger man. Inoue has never submitted in competition and Kerr is not a master at that. This seems to point to a long fight, and at that point stamina becomes the big issue. Although people who have seen both would say Kerr is a much larger man, the Kerr who was in Abu Dhabi may have been smaller than the Inoue in Abu Dhabi. Still, Kerr has freakish strength, and even if he's the smaller man, and I'd bet this time he won't be, he's not getting overpowered. One would think looking at the two that the new version of Kerr would have a decided edge in stamina. Probably the most important thing to realize is that this fight will not have judges, so no matter who dominates, if it goes the time limit, it's a draw, and that changes the nature of the fight. This show comes 6 days after the Frank Shamrock vs. Kiyoshi Tamura match on the Rings show in Osaka. This will be under Rings rules, and every change in rules changes the fight. However, with Shamrock being well experienced from his years in Pancrase under similar rules and having gone 30 minutes to a win over Tsuyoshi Kosaka under these rules in 1997, he will hardly be a fish out of water against the Rings specialist. Tamura is a hard one to judge because it's hard to know exactly what he is. He is, without question, one of the best pro wrestlers in the world and the single best working mat wrestler of all time. That's all well and good in pro wrestling, but doesn't mean much in a shoot. It's very hard to judge strengths and weaknesses of someone in a shoot by what they do in matches designed to entertain the audience and put on a very realistic-looking show, but a show nonetheless. Tamura, like Hiromitsu Kanehara, and probably Sakuraba as well, are so good at working that some of their worked matches look like shoots, which makes judging them in shoots even harder. What we know about Tamura and shooting is that it is believed he did tap out Kosaka in a shoot, which would make him the only guy to do that in years, although we can't be sure of that. Kosaka was legitimately injured from the finish, which seems to indicate it was real, but not necessarily either. There was one spot that looked kind of funny, and let's face it, these guys are real good. If the win over Kosaka wasn't predetermined, that makes Tamura very real. Maurice Smith, who hasn't tapped out since in competition, claims Tamura tapped him out legit when they had a match in 1996. Tamura is clearly respected by other fighters are being very real and a real threat, and even Shamrock conceded they are fairly even on the ground. Tamura did lose a shoot last year to Valentin Overeem, who was unheralded in submissions but did have him by 30 pounds, and when the two were rematched in February, Rings made sure this time it was a work, and hooked Tamura a few times in quick order and really hurt his rep. Shamrock should be stronger standing and Tamura can be hit, but with head punches illegal, open hands are legal. That negates some of that edge. The other match of intrigue will be the May 7th UFC main event with Boss Rutten versus Kevin Randleman to crown the vacant heavyweight title in a tournament which makes almost as much sense as some of the recent WCW tournaments. This is the classic intrigue because Rutten is a great striker. Randleman is an excellent wrestler and a far stronger man physically. Rutten was taken down several times by Kosaka, whose takedown ability pales in comparison to Randleman. Randleman, from his win over Maurice Smith, has an amazing level of stamina that belies his freakish physique. Rutten is better at submissions once they are on the ground. Like the Kosaka match, this may be a match where John McCarthy plays a major part. Many believe that had McCarthy not ordered a stand-up late in regulation, when Rutten nailed Kosaka with a kick to the knee which ultimately led to his demise, that Kosaka would have ruined the debut of the Man Semaphore Entertainment Group billed as the world's greatest martial arts fighter. Most likely this match is going to the ground pretty fast with Randleman on top. Rutten is going to have a very difficult time on his own getting out of that position. So the question becomes how effective Randleman can be from the top, and if or when McCarthy orders the stand-up, and then if Rutten can get a telling blow in before he's taken down again. The WWF, and pro wrestling in general, has been dominating the recreational sports listings for sales of home videos as compiled weekly by Billboard magazine for months, but never as much as this week. For the week of April 10th, 19th of the top 20 selling videos in that listing were pro wrestling tapes, with only one tape, at number 9, a tape of Super Bowl 33, preventing it from being a clean sweep. In order, the top 20 tapes were Austin 3:16 uncensored, The Stone Cold Said So, WrestleMania 14, WrestleMania 3, Undertaker the Phenom, Goldberg, Best of Survivor Series, Three Faces of Foley, Super Bowl 33, Sting, Best of WrestleMania, Sable Unleashed, D-Generation X, WrestleMania 12, WrestleMania 6, WrestleMania 13, Best of Fall Brawl, Diamond Dallas Page, WrestleMania 10 and Best of Blast, Sick, at the Beach. An interesting aspect of WWF dominance on this chart, with 14 of the top 20, is that the chart is called recreational sports and the WWF has been strongly protesting any categorizing of what it does as sports. It's all a semantic argument to begin with, as we all know what pro wrestling is, but it's a debatable point what category it fits into. For whatever reason, the subject of backyard wrestling seems to be one of the latest stories on wrestling in the media. ABC's 2020 had a piece scheduled for April 7th, which includes interviews with Mick Foley, the Crown Prince and ultimate hero and god to every teenager who wants to bash a light bulb into their head and fall on thumbtacks, and Vince McMahon. This was actually a focal point of a cover piece a few weeks back in USA Today, and Inside Edition is also working on a backyard wrestling piece. WWF on Raw even publicized McMahon's taped appearance on the show. According to an article in the April 6th Ventura County Star, Andre Verdun of Buena High School is expected to be a featured part of the story. Verdun has gotten some local pub and was mentioned in these pages many weeks back for having the police shut down his backyard-style wrestling matches where they do use barbed wire and fluorescent light tubes. Even though the police told him and his friends to stop it, they did hold another match last week. Verdun told ABC that it's entertainment and he's training for a career as a pro wrestler. Inside Edition has also asked to interview Verdun. Although the idea of teenagers slicing their foreheads with razor blades or cutting themselves up with barbed wire to copy the pros is distasteful, whether this is an epidemic worthy of so much attention is something else. If there was an epidemic and hospitals were reporting a large amount of injuries to teenagers, to me, then it's a real story. I don't believe that to be the case. The fact that a group of kids do things like this and aren't getting hurt badly, although the fact is that they could get hurt, doesn't to me seem any different from kids playing tackle football in the street with no pads, which wasn't a major news story when I was a kid, and we did it all the time and were always getting banged up. Looking back, it was so unbelievably stupid because we could have gone around the corner and played on grass and it would have been a lot safer, and there would still be some potential dangers from it, but that's just how kids are and nothing is going to change that. To me, if this stuff does inspire a rash of injuries, then it absolutely is a real story. At this point, I'm not sure what is really is because we aren't reading about people getting broken necks from pile drivers or smashed ribs for jumping off high places onto each other without knowing how to protect yourself and the other guy. It could happen just as you could land wrong doing skateboard stunts or riding the wrong wave and get injured very badly. That's nothing that couldn't have happened 10 or even 25 years ago when kids played pro wrestler on their lawns, which is also hardly something new. With wrestling in a hot phase, it's probably more prevalent. I'd bet few if any kids trying to play pro wrestler hit each other over the head with light bulbs and ceiling tiles, which make a nice mess but aren't very dangerous, in the past because the pros weren't doing it in those days. But plenty of kids were recklessly practicing pile drivers back then. I remember when I was a kid seeing teenagers, not an everyday thing, but you'd see them when you'd go to the live matches, with fresh blade scars because they wanted to emulate the pros, something I haven't seen at matches in years. I saw it in California. I saw it in Florida. I'm sure it happened everywhere where kids grew up watching pros blading and figuring it out or hearing about it on a regular basis. I remember as a kid watching a teenager blade himself in front of me at the parking lot of the Miami Beach Convention Center, thinking it made him ultra cool because he was doing what his idol Dusty Rhodes did during the show and was so smart because he knew how it was done. While it's sort of gross, the chances of serious injury from it are pretty minimal. You can get infections or cut an artery, but in all the years of pro wrestlers blading regularly, that happens infrequently, but it has happened, a lot lower than skateboard stunts or probably even playing high school football. And as it turned out, some of the kids I saw do blading as teenagers did end up being pro wrestlers. Anyway, my feeling on this is the same as the deaths and the drug story, except with entirely different conclusions. If the death rate among pro wrestlers was no different than that of pro baseball players or college football players or whatever, it would be no story, or at least no story any bigger than the same story in those sports. For those who somehow think pro wrestling is being picked on because it's popular, I'd suggest pro wrestling had long gotten a free pass because even though it was popular, the media felt it was a subject beneath worrying about. During 1997, 3 college wrestlers died over a brief period because of drastically cutting weight. There are approximately 3,000 college wrestlers every season. There are approximately 200 Major League American pro wrestlers at least over the past few years. Last year there were 198. There are 2 or 3 pros dying every year rather than just in one bad year that's an aberration like 1997 in the amateurs. The deaths in college wrestling last season led to conservatively 20 times more media attention over a few-week period than all the deaths in pro wrestling over the past 5 years combined, despite pro wrestling being far more popular than college wrestling, despite it being a one-season fluke rather than a pattern that is repeated almost every year. Those 3 amateur wrestling deaths also led to widespread changes in rules as far as weight cutting and weigh-ins, which, while not a cure, was a valid step in the right direction, and there wasn't one similar type death this past season. Pro wrestling's deaths have brought about few if any significant changes. The schedule is easier is the only change I can think of, and the responses are more along the lines of denials and attacking the messengers and crying about stories being unfair hatchet jobs and crying about how people are against pro wrestling for whatever reason rather than any actions of real consequence. If the death rate was the same as in other major league sports, the drug usage wouldn't be a big story because it exists to some degree in every sport. But that's not the case. That's why people can issue all the denials they want and talk about wrestlers being singled out unfairly and about drug cheating in the Olympics or no drug tests in baseball, and God knows problems exist in all sports, but the denials don't hold water because the death rate in those sports is so much lower so that it ruins the validity of those responses. If the injury rate among kids trying to be Mick Foley becomes more serious than kids playing football on pavement or racing bikes or jumping off cliffs and whatever else kids do for thrills, then it's a story. Hopefully somewhere in the mass of news reports, someone will investigate that aspect rather than sensationalize one's incident because it makes for a good television visual, and we'll find out if it's a real issue or one created. The gap wasn't as great as the past 2 weeks, and Nitro was even competitive in 2 quarters, but Raw still won the April 5th Monday Night War handily as expected. With both shows generally considered way below par, Raw finished with a 5.83 rating, 5.50 first hour, 6.13 seconds hour, and 9.0 share. Nitro finished with a 4.32 rating, 4.24 first hour, 4.21 seconds hour, 4.49 third hour, and a 6.7 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 2 minutes it was Raw at 5.77, it picked up 0.06 by going almost 4 minutes longer at the end, to Nitro's 4.35, so it was actually a major closing of the gap from last week where the head-to-head gap was a record-setting 3.35 ratings points. There was both good news and bad news from a WCW standpoint. The good news is that 2 quarters were very close. In the 4th quarter, Raw held a 5.19 to 4.94 lead with Snow vs. Holly squaring off against the NWO Black and White Battle Royal. While the latter may have been the worst television match involving people that actually are trained pro wrestlers of the year, it was something of a curious ratings success despite dying a brutal death live. WCW also came close in the main event, with a four-way for the WCW title with Flair, Goldberg, Hogan and Page doing a 5.42 rating and 5.77 overrun, easily the high watermark of the show. The Raw main event of White vs. Triple H and Rock did a 5.55 final quarter, and while it did a whopping 7.19 overrun, most of that overrun period was going unopposed, so there is actually a chance Nitro may have for a few minutes beaten Raw. The bad news was the first hour. WCW could count on a huge first hour rating going unopposed, until the last month of absolutely awful television started eroding that rating. There was the belief that nothing court hurt the first hour because there was no other choice, but the past 2 weeks of doing 4.2 ratings unopposed when realistically the first hour should be hovering close to a 6.0 shows they've killed that portion of the show. The ratings pattern indicate that Nitro was saved and became almost competitive because they presented a main event that people wanted to see, but not much else that they cared about. Although the women tearing clothes on Raw did a 6.0 rating, without Sable involved, it wasn't the high quarter of the night. Raw peaked, and had its biggest advantage in Quarter 7 doing a 6.72 rating for Goldust vs. Godfather, As If, and the Ministry's Crucifixion. Nitro in the same quarter fell to a 3.76 rating for Bigelow vs. Bagwell. In other Monday night news that may become a small factor in the fall, Monday Night Football is being moved back to its original 9 p.m. Eastern Time start time. The show last season was moved up 1 hour with the idea that it would increase the East Coast viewership, where the population base is the highest, to have the games end at 11:30 p.m. instead of well after midnight. The experiment was deemed a failure since MNF had its lowest rated season in history. On the East Coast, ratings only rose slightly from a 12.1 to a 12.5 for the season. In the Central Time Zone, MNF fell from a 19.7 rating to a 17.3, while on the West Coast, the ratings fell from a 21.1 to an 18.5. In another MNF weirdly related note, on Raw, Jerry Lawler quoted an article from Jim Varsalone of the Miami Herald. I haven't seen the article, but most of Varsalone's wrestling articles have been good, so it would surprise me if Varsalone actually claimed, as Lawler said, that ESPN is owned by the same company that owns ABC, and so both networks came up with hatchet job stories because they are mad that Raw kicked the ass of MNF last season. While there is no question the popularity of wrestling, and that is both wrestling shows because in the fall both did great numbers, cut into football, as you can see the change in the starting times probably had every bit as much of an effect. Besides, MNF drew a 13.9 network rating in the fall. The audience for Raw head-to-head was only equivalent to a 4.0 network rating head-to-head, which hardly constitutes even the most drug-induced perception of an ass-kicking. The 17.2 rating that the NCAA Finals did on CBS last Monday was the lowest-rated NCAA Finals since 1982, and USA Today did note that the two wrestling shows, which on March 29 did a combined 7.4 network rating and are strong with the young male demographic, probably played a part in holding the basketball rating down. Largest U.S. pro wrestling crowds in history. Based on paid attendance for modern-era shows or estimated attendance from various sources. Generally speaking, until the 80s, because pro wrestling relied almost exclusively on revenue derived from the live gate, the practice of papering houses for major shows didn't really exist to the level it did over the past 2 decades. Exaggerations of attendance numbers in the past most definitely did. There would have to be considered a great degree of conjecture to the legitimacy of most of the older figures. Any documentation that would either legitimize or disclaim any of these numbers would be welcome. We are also looking for any documented proof of attendance figures greater than 30,000 for shows outside North America and Japan, where our records are pretty complete. In particular, we are looking for information from India, Pakistan, the Middle East, Europe, Singapore, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, where we know there have been many shows over the years that drew huge crowds that have been lost in the bowels of history. 1. 78,000 WWF Pontiac Silverdome on March 29, 1987, Hogan vs. Andre 2. 48,014 WWF San Antonio Alamo Dome on January 21, 1997, Michaels vs. Sid 3. 47,000 WWF Indianapolis Hoosier Dome on April 5, 1992, Hogan vs. Sid 4. 40,000 Bowser AWA Boston Fenway Park on July 30, 1935, Dano O'Mahony vs. Ed Don George 5. 38,756, Darrow Promotions Los Angeles Rose Bowl on October 10, 1934, Jim Londos vs. Man Mountain Dean 6. 38,622 Kohler Promotions Chicago Comiskey Park on June 30, 1961, Buddy Rogers vs. Pat O'Connor 7. 35,771, WWF New York Shea Stadium on August 9, 1980, Sammartino vs. Zbyszko 8. 35,514, WCW Atlanta Georgia Dome on July 6, 1998, Hogan vs. Goldberg 9. 35,265, Chicago Wrigley Field on September 20, 1934, Strangler Lewis vs. Londos 10. 35,000, Curly/Mont Promotions New York Madison Square Garden Bowl in June 1932, Lewis vs. Dick Chicot 11. 34,788, WCW Atlanta Georgia Dome on January 4, 1999 Nitro, no main event announced 12. 32,123, World Class Dallas Texas Stadium on May 6, 1984, Flair vs. Kerry Von Erich 13. 32,000, WWF New York Shea Stadium on June 25, 1976, Inoki vs. Ali Closed Circuit / Sammartino vs. Hansen Live 14. 32,000, Bowser AWA Boston Braves Field on July 30, 1931, Gus Sonnenberg vs. Henri de Glane 15. 31,460, WCW Houston Astrodome on December 7, 1998 Nitro, no main event announced 16. 30,000, Ganya AWA Chicago Comiskey Park on August 14, 1970, Crusher and Bruiser vs. Bacon 17. 30,000, Bowser AWA Boston Fenway Park on June 27, 1935, Londos vs. O'Mahony 18. 30,000, Kohler Promotions Chicago Comiskey Park on September 1, 1961, Rogers vs. O'Connor 19. 30,000, Curly Mont Promotions New York Yankee Stadium on June 29, 1931, Londos vs. Ray Steele. Worldwide crowds of more than 30,000 we have records of based on promoter. 30 New Japan Pro Wrestling. 8 Vince McMahon Jr. Titan Sports WWF. Atsushi Onita FMW. 3 Eric Bischoff WCW. Paul Bowser AWA Boston. 2 Shohei Baba All Japan Pro Wrestling. Vince McMahon Sr. Capital Sports WWF. Antonio Pena AAA, Nobuhiko Takada UWFI, Genichiro Tenryu SWS, Fred Kohler Promotions Chicago, KRS Pride, Jack Curly Toots Mont New York. 1 Akira Maeda UWF, Takashi Matsunaga / All Japan Women, Lou Darrow Promotions Los Angeles, Fritz Von Erich World Class, Vern Gagne AWA, Rikitos and JWA. Most times in main event. 10 Antonio Inoki. 9 Shinya Hashimoto, Hulk Hogan, Genichiro Tenryu. 7 Keiji Muto, Nobuhiko Takada, Tatsumi Fujinami, Atsushi Onita. 6 Riki Choshu. 3 Ric Flair, Masahiro Chono, Jim Londos, Masked Superstar. 2 Scott Norton Ultimate Warrior Kensuke Sasaki, Mitsuharu Misawa Sid, Naoya Ogawa Hayabusa, Terry Funk, Buddy Rogers, Pat O'Connor, Hickson Gracie, Bruno Sammartino, Mr. Pogo, Strangler Lewis, Bad News Allen. Japanese Television Rundown. March 9, Pancrase. Judging from the magazine photos, this looked to be the best show in a long time, and in this case, that was accurate. 1. Daisuke Ishii beat Daisuke Watanabe via unanimous decision after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. The regulation time was even with nobody getting a good advantage and all 3 judges ruled it a draw. In the overtime, Ishii gave Watanabe a bloody nose and mounted him and was pounding on him with open hands to win the decision. A typical Pancrase-style match, 2. Ikuiza Minowa won a unanimous decision after 10 minutes over Kosei Kubota. Minowa gave Kubota a bloody nose on the first exchange and took him down and was hitting him with open hands to the face. They rolled out of the ring with Minowa behind Kubota. Kubota did have one reversal during the match, but Minowa took control again and nearly got a choke as well. 3. In a Vale Tudo Rules interpromotional match, Keiichiro Yamamiya beat Yuhi Sano in 10:43 via ref stoppage. This was the bloodiest match I can ever recall in Pancrase. Sano, the former traditional pro wrestler best known for his legendary matches with Jushin Liger about 10 years ago, should have stayed a pro wrestler because whenever he does shoots, he gets pulled. He has no speed on his feet, isn't good at takedowns and has no defense. Even worse, he's one of those Japanese types who swells up and bleeds easily, and this, like his match on the October 11th Tokyo Dome show, got ridiculous. Yamamiya, who is much smaller, kept the match standing. The first 4 minutes were mainly dancing with very little action. Sano started getting tired and Yamamiya went at him and started connecting with punches. Sano quickly got a bloody nose. The two started head-butting each other, which is legal under Pancrase Valley Tudo rules, which wound up with Sano bleeding badly from the left eye. It was that luchador bloodbath type of look. Yamamiya kept tagging him, and soon he was bleeding from his right eye. More head-butting and punching by Yamamiya before the ref finally stopped the match with Sano covered in blood. 4. Semishult beat Takafumi Ito in 145. With a size difference 6'10.5", 260 versus 5'7", 170, fans were laughing as they squared off. Ito actually got the first takedown with an ankle pick, but was quickly reversed and Schultz grabbed a headlock and started cranking. Ito fought it off for a minute but couldn't break free and tapped. 5. Kyuma Kunyoku won a unanimous decision over Yuki Kondo in 15 minutes. This result was a minor embarrassment since Kondo was being pushed for a title shot with Schultz as the April 18 pay-per-view main event. This was the best Pancrase match in a long time. Two guys of similar size and experience really going for it in a very competitive match. If this was boxing, no doubt Kondo would have got the decision since he was the bigger name and the one being built up, but I guess this shows Pancrase is more honest than pro boxing. What isn't? Constant good exchanges standing and continual attempts for submissions. Kondo nearly got the ankle. Kunyoku got the mount and began slapping at the face and got a near choke but Kondo reversed him. Kondo went for the ankle but was reversed. Kondo was going for a side choke when they were near the ropes and both fell out of the ring. Kunyoku nearly got a guillotine. Kunyoku was bleeding from the nose and mouth with his lips swollen. They had a great standing exchange with Kunyoku connecting more before he took Kondo down and went for an ankle lock, but again the fact they were falling out of the ring stopped the movement. This really shows again how a traditional boxing/wrestling ring is a bad playing field for legitimate shoots. They were slapping the hell out of each other in the closing minutes as they went for broke trying to win the decision. 6. Ryushi Yanagisawa drew Manabu Yamada over 15 minutes. This was an even match with attempts at moves, but nothing compared with the previous match and nobody ever got a strong advantage. March 14th All Japan. 1. Kobashi and Akiyama retained the double tag titles beating Misawa and Ogawa in 30-49. This was arguably the best match so far this year. The first 5 minutes were great, mainly the exchanges with Ogawa and Akiyama exchanging moves. Misawa did his elbow suicida on Kobashi, which was really well set up. Everything these guys do is well set up. The match really slowed in the middle. They don't miss anything and it all builds, but the crowd was quiet for close to 14 minutes. The match probably would have been better about 8 minutes shorter because attention spans aren't there for these long building middles for a television audience, although this was the perfect match for the live crowd at Budokan Hall, which is conditioned to the style. All Japan's ratings are excellent and this match aired in its entirety, so maybe it also seems like a dated style because of shorter attention spans to someone watching so much American wrestling. At the 19 minutes mark, Kobashi dropped Misawa on his head with a head and arm suplex which jolted everyone up, and the last 12 minutes of this match was the best wrestling so far this year with big moves, great exchanges, and more importantly the crowd going nuts. It was similar to the Austin Rock Raw match from last year for Heat, although the wrestling was better. In the context of the match, the 30-49 worked as far as building to the finish when all was said and done. They all pulled out every move in their arsenal for near falls but huge crowd pops. Akiyama ended up pinning Ogawa after a power bomb off the middle ropes followed by an exploder suplex. 4 3/4 stars. Mexico. El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas captured the CMLL tag titles from Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. via DQ before yet another sellout crowd of 5,500 at Mexico City's Arena Coliseo on April 2nd in the 56th anniversary of pro wrestling in the building. Ironically, the first match ever in the arena was April 2, 1943, where Tarzan Lopez beat El Santo to win the Mexican welterweight title in a match which has gone down in Mexican folklore as one of the legendary matches in history. It should be noted that at the time, Santo, who was the Rudo, was not nearly the star he would eventually become in the 60s. The match started with an angle as Zumbito and Scorpio Jr. were heavily fined for the Angel, where they trashed ref Roberto Rangel's car. They were told that if they couldn't pay the fine, they'd be suspended, so they went to Apollo Dantes and Gran Marcus Jr. and told them to talk with the man in black, presumably Cien Caras as El Capo de Capo, who gave them the money to pay the fine, and then coming into the building, they started making fun again of Rangel because they weren't suspended. In the third fall, Scorpio accidentally hit second ref El Maya with an elbow drop and power-bombed Casas, and had him pinned. Rangel hit the ring and DQ'd Scorpio and Salvaje for the title change because Maya had been hit, even though he actually didn't see it. It's weird in a sense because they did a DQ finish with Santo and Casas winning on February 5th, and in that match they refused the belts because of the nature of the finish, but this time with a similar ending they accepted them. The match went more than 30 minutes and got mixed reviews. Also on the show was the 6th annual Grand Alternative Young Lions tournament where an established star teams with a rising star, and the rising star, a non-main eventer, gets to headline the next 3 weeks. It wound up with Blue Panther and Ultimo Guerrero beating Mr. Niebla and Atlantico, and by the Stips, Guerrero gets to be in the main event on the next 3 Friday nights. CMLL continued what looks to be its best business year in a long time with another sellout at Arena Coliseo 2 nights later with the annual Easter Spectacular headlined by Mr. Niebla winning a singles match over Blue Panther using the ropes to set up a no-ref match on April 11th. They are also setting up El Hijo del Gladiador as a challenger for Astro Rey Jr.'s Mexican national welterweight title as Gladiador destroyed him in a trios match and issued a challenge for the title after pinning him. AAA ran 2 big shows this past week. The first was March 31st in San Luis Potosi before a sellout 7,500 headlined by a cage match with the kickboxer and Thai boxer and Carlos Gutierrez and Antonio Silva, beating the wrestlers, Heavy Metal and Pero Arguello Jr., and La Parca Jr. and Mascara Sagrada Jr., and Cibernetico beating Canek in a dog collar match. The other was Pero Arguello's farewell match in Netzahualcoyot, which drew a sellout 12,000. Arguello's retirement tour is packing them in every city, with Arguello and AAA Mascara Sagrada and El Alabrije over Sangre Chicana and Cobarde Sr. and Cibernetico. After the match, which ended with Arguello pinning Cobarde, El Texano, the uncle of WCW's Silver King, showed up and attacked Arguello with a chain and also attacked both press people and security. In a couple of mask matches over the past month on March 3rd in Acapulco, Ultimo Dragon Cheeto beat local wrestler Aristoteles, who turned out to be Jorge Quamia Lopez, and on March 19th in Mexico City, Lady Discovery beat Princesa Guerrera, who turned out to be Olga Cisneros. Also, in what is being reported as a first time ever, Atlantis beat the same man for his mask twice. In 1987, Atlantis beat Hombre Bala in a mask versus mask match, revealing him to be Aurelio Ortiz. On March 22nd in Leon, Atlantis won a mask versus mask match over Ray Purata, who wound up being Ortiz. On April 21st in Aguascalientes, Purata Morgan is putting up the old IWC heavyweight title. I thought Pierroth had that belt and it became the IC belt in Puerto Rico, against the mask of the original Mascara Sagrada. Morgan joked that winning his mask isn't a big deal because there must be 10 or so Mascara Sagradas running around Mexico. It appears they are also doing a title match on April 11th at the IWRG TV tapings in Naucalpan. The 3 younger brothers of Canek, Principe Maya and Gio and Neo, who used to wrestle as Danes 1 and 2 all debuted on April 4th for IWRG April 9th in Tijuana, is headlined by Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Rey Mysterio Sr. and Psicosis, Super Parca and La Parca and Brazo de Plata versus Cien Caras and Venom Black and Tornado Negro and a Minis Battle Royal. The deal with El Gigante Silva is that WWF is sending him to Mexico for 20 days per month, and he is then flown home for 10 days per month to see his family, so his leaving was just part of his worked out schedule, and not any kind of booking ideas from EMLL about not overexposing him. While he is a novelty draw because of his size being unique, he's in Mexico to learn to perform in front of a crowd so the WWF can attempt to get something out of him in the future, and his salary is largely being paid by WWF, so his role is to learn to work the crowd as opposed to being a draw in Mexico. All Japan announced the public funeral for Giant Baba on April 17th at Budokan Hall would be at 10 a.m. and that Hansen, Bruno Sammartino, Dick Bayer and Lord James Blears would be coming in for it. Standings as of the morning of April 6th in the Carnival Tournament, with all the wrestlers having completed 9 matches, are as follows. 1. Kenta Kobashi, 6 wins, 0 losses. 2. Vader, 6 wins, 1 loss. 3. Dasawa, 4 wins, 1 draw, 1 loss. 4. Johnny Ace, 4 wins, 2 losses. 5. Akira Taue and Gary Albright, 3 wins, 3 losses each. 7. Jun Akiyama, 2 wins, 3 draws, 1 loss. 8. Yoshihiro Takayama, 0 wins, 4 draws, 1 loss. 9. Takawamori, 0 wins, 6 draws, 1 loss. 10. Shinzaki, 0 wins, 5 losses. Reports we've gotten are that even with his foot injury, Kobashi's matches this week have been great. Carnival results for the week were: March 31st in Niigata drew a sellout 2,900 as Ace pinned Shinzaki in 12:47 with an Ace Crusher. Taue pinned Omori in 15:36 after 2 Natawas and Kobashi pinned Misawa in 24:15 after a lariat. April 2nd in Okayama before 2,900 had Vader pinned Shinzaki in 12:41 with the Big Van Crush. Kobashi pinned Takayama in 11:52 with a lariat and Misawa and Akiyama went to a 30-minute draw. April 3rd in Tokushima before a sellout 2,100 had Vader over Omori in 2:10 when the ref stopped the match after Vader destroyed Omori with punches in the corner. Ace pinned Akiyama with the Cobra Clutch Suplex in 10:23 and Taue pinned Albright in 9:44 with the Natawa. April 4th in Hiroshima drew 2,400 saw Misawa pinned Omori in 12:16. Vader pinned Albright in 7:23 with one of those really screwy Scott Norton-like endings. Even though Vader was supposed to go over, either Albright or the ref screwed up as Albright kicked out, and the ref counted 3. The fans were pissed and it made Vader look real bad. Vader really was playing big time to the audience that was turning on the company. Main event had Kobashi pin Akiyama in 24:37 with a lariat. April 5th in Hakata Star Lanes before 2,200 saw Albright pin Shinzaki in 12:36, Akiyama pinned Takayama in 9:12 and Kobashi pinned Taue in 17:06, and April 6th in Kumamoto City Gymnasium before 2,250 saw Vader pin Taue in 7:41. Kobashi pinned Shinzaki in 16:12 and Ace pinned Omori in 8:41. New Japan. There has been no real media push now just days before the Dome show. We're told tickets aren't going well and a lot of the heat is being directed at the push given to the Atsushi Onita vs Masahiro Chono match. Even though Onita got great heat for his TV angles building this up totally Americanized angles, the feeling is that New Japan fans consider Onita as a joke and aren't interested in buying tickets to see him in a gimmick match. Even though they've done run-ins to try and build it, Keiji Muto vs Don Frye isn't a strong enough match to headline an April Dome show. The January Dome show is like Wrestlemania, and it's going to sell out regardless of what the card is, but the April show needs a killer main event, or it won't go over. If worse comes to worse, like in 1997, when Ken Shamrock pulled out of the main event against Shinya Hashimoto and Naoya Ogawa's name wasn't strong enough to wrestling fans to headline first time out, although after he beat Hashimoto in his debut, it was then strong enough to sell out the Osaka Dome a few weeks later. They may have to heavily paper the show. Almost no pub has been given due to trying to sell Dome tickets to the next tour, which starts April 13th in Sendai with a Genichiro Tenryu and Tatsumi Fujinami vs Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima main event. Shocker is expected to come in to work the junior heavyweight division. Seiji Sakaguchi held a press conference to announce former Japanese college rugby star Kenzo Suzuki, 24, joining the company. Suzuki is 6'3", 235 pounds, and Sakaguchi said he would debut on the company's first show in 2000. Other Japan notes. The April 4th GF 4th anniversary show with the Chigusa Nagio vs Lioness Asuka first meeting in about 10 years with the winner getting control of the company was a huge success as they turned away thousands at the door and reported a sellout of 6,500, definitely an inflated number as there is no way to put that many people in that building. Probably 5,000 to 5,500 would be more accurate. Asuka won the match in 16:59, so as a storyline, she is now both the president and booker of the company. Both Nagio and the ref juiced heavily from Asuka's foreign objects. Asuka won the match after throwing a fireball, and then using the torture rack bomb for the pin. Originally the match was to be for Nagio's AW title, but it was apparently changed to a non-title. After the match, Asia Kong, who worked the undercard, came out and asked Asuka if she could challenge Nagio for the title. There was a ton of heat after the match, and it was reported as not being good heat, as fans wouldn't leave the building because they were mad about all the gimmicks being used to lead to the finish. Kong did a surprising job in the semi-final in a tag match teaming with Mayumi Ozaki to lose to Gia wrestlers Sonoko Kato and Meiko Satomura when Little Satomura pinned Kong after 2 Death Valley bombs. In another upset, Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda of Neo Ladies lost to Gia's team of Kaoru and Toshio Yamada in 38-28 when Kaoru pinned Shimoda. It was by far the biggest show in the history of the company. Nagio and Asuka were the biggest tag team in the history of women's wrestling during the 80s as the Crush Gals. There has been a lot of media talk about the future of the UFO company. Gong magazine reported the company as breaking up and said that Satoru Sayama would be leaving the company after philosophical differences about direction with Antonio Inoki. Sayama was basically running the company as both president and booker. However, other newspapers are reporting that Sayama is still in the office. UFO on its English website also reported Sayama leaving and kind of gave him a subtle knock, noting that he had also quit New Japan while he was on top of the pro wrestling business and later quit UWF. While this hasn't been announced publicly, apparently the plans are for the next UFO show to be on June 17 in Osaka, and that some sort of a business relationship may be done with the Pride organization, as they've talked about Mark Coleman, Nobuhiko Tada and Tenryu as possible opponents for Naoya Ogawa on that show. The plan for Ogawa's first title defense to be in Newton, Iowa on April 24 in conjunction with both the Cauliflower Alley Banquet and the Hall of Fame inductions to the American Wrestling, both pro and amateur under the same roof for the first time, museum were dropped. After a lot of thought, the feeling is that it wouldn't go over well to put on a worked match with Ogawa versus Dan Severn in front of a crowd that would be consisting of so many name amateur wrestlers. The NWA is working on getting Ogawa a visa to come to the US and defend the title, and the UFO organization will be flying him in, so it makes the trans more reasonable for the small indie groups that form the NWA to use him while in the country. Although the bottom line is that Ogawa on the card isn't going to mean anything for ticket sales. And the only plus is any show he's on will get exposure overseas in the Japanese media, which at least theoretically could help open the doors to Japan of anyone who he's booked with. Got another report of the March 23 Rings show and the Ilyukhin Mikhail win over Randy Couture. We should have a tape by the end of the week, but the match went as described last week. Apparently the announcers acknowledged the finish as controversial and that the Raw's team complaint about the finish was well taken. There are two controversies. One, which everyone apparently agrees with, is that as Mikhail was working for a move and they got to the corner and were put back in the center in the same position, that Mikhail got the jump on Couture in the restart and got the finishing move. The other controversy is whether, when caught in the hold, that Couture was tapping out, or punching Mikhail in the leg, but the referee mistook that for a tap. Apparently the schedule of doing shoots and stiff works on a monthly basis is breaking a lot of the guys who do every show down, as you can imagine. The new Now promotion headed by Kendo Nagasaki Kazuo Sakurada ran a show on April 4 at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym, drawing a reported 4,000 fans for Nagasaki and Tenryu and Masaaki Mochizuki over Takashi Okamura and Nobutaka Araya and Yoshiaki Fujiwara on top. The show included wrestlers from WAR, LLPW, IWA, SPWF, JWP and several other smaller independents. Ricky Banderas, who is working as an undercard wrestler for Big Japan, is a Puerto Rican wrestler who was sent to Japan. He previously worked Mexico to gain experience and be used as one of the top wrestlers when Victor Quiñones plans to open up a regular territory in Puerto Rico to oppose Carlos Colon later this year, probably with Banderas, Miguel Perez and Savio Vega as the top stars. Men's Teo, formerly of WWF Kaientai fame, is feuding with Abdullah the Butcher on the current Big Japan tour. The deal is that Teo's idol is Terry Funk and his original wrestling name was Terry Boy, and of course Funk vs. Abdullah is one of the legendary feuds in Japanese history from the 70s. On the show where Amigo Kato was injured, the main event was a twin-star version tag title match with champs Ri Tamada and Hiromi Yagi going to a 30-minute draw with Mika Akino and Ayako Hamada. All Japan Women on April 11 at Korakuen Hall is headlining with an interpromotional match with Mita and Shimoda vs. Saps INT in a death match with falls counting anywhere and all weapons legal, and will have 3 refs. Christopher Daniels debuts in Japan for Michinoku Pro in April. Here and there. Herb Welch of the famous Welch wrestling family passed away this past week in his 80s. Herb, Roy, Lester and Jackie Welch were the original 4 brothers that started one of the biggest wrestling families of all time, and over the generations included at least 26 different wrestlers with wrestling names like the Fullers. Buddy Fuller, father of Robert and Ron, was actually the son of Roy. The Goldens, Billy Golden married one of the sisters, and the Hatfields, who wrestled as the Fields Boys in the South, and also married one of the sisters. Welch promoted in Dyersburg, Tennessee for years and was very popular with the boys because he would include a box office breakdown in his payoffs for the boys to see, so they knew he was being honest. The other Tennessee promoters in those days were not nearly so honest and felt Herb being honest was making the rest of them look bad. Earl Sullivan, who ran Sully's Gym in Toronto where Ron Hutchison and Sweet Daddy Siki before him trained many pro wrestlers including Edge, Christian and Tiger Ali Singh, recently also passed away over the past week. Tickets for the Brian Pillman Memorial Show at the Cincinnati Gardens on May 19 should be on sale in the area. Confirmed as appearing besides Ricky Steamboat and Woman are Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, and Dean Malenko. There is dialogue with the WWF about bringing in big names, but nothing is confirmed. It appears Otto Wanz is not going to be running CWA this summer and won't be starting back until the end of the year. Speaking of Pillman, Melanie Pillman Smith has been studying the effects of growth hormone in medical classes for the past year and is convinced that is what killed Brian, which is why she showed the records of Pillman buying the drugs on the ESPN special. Specifically, it is her belief that Pillman was so using HGH regularly for almost 18 months, and stopped cold turkey just a few weeks before his death, largely due to not being able to afford the drug since it has such an expensive price tag and the two of them going through financial problems. Her belief is that going off cold turkey after the drug enlarged his heart is what led to his heart giving out. It could be that combined with many other factors, and it may not have anything to do with that, as there were so many things. It could have been that. No answer will ever be anything more than a guess. Over the past year I've gotten into many arguments with a few in the media and talked several reporters out of trying to tie in Pillman's death to steroids. He was a young athlete who had used steroids at different points in his life and died of heart problems, so there is an easy and natural connection to make, but that doesn't mean he died from them, and I just don't buy that he did because he didn't use them in huge amounts, although anything is possible. And blame McMahon for dropping steroid testing, and that does make a damning story if one wants to go in that direction, because I never believed that was the major cause and nobody went there. Mushnick did once right after the death, but I don't believe has since. Steroids and HGH are entirely different, although they are used by athletes in a synergistic combination and are often confused by laypeople for one another. Basically, steroids tend to bloat and puff the muscles, creating that shot up with an air hose effect. HGH hardens the body, making it possible to get very hard and cut while not paying as much serious attention to diet. HGH, like clenbuterol, are popular drugs among strippers, both male and female, and dancers, because they keep that annoying fat away from the back of the legs and butt, which is very difficult even with exercise and a good diet for women, particularly as they get older. It also can enlarge internal organs, such as possibly the heart, the potential connection here in the Pillman story, and creates those people who have the changing facial structure, such as growing jaws and thickening foreheads as years go by, that you see in some wrestlers, and that hard look of strippers that have gotten old. HGH can't be detected in tests. Some feel the Olympics are dragging their feet when it comes to creating and implementing tests that can catch it, similar to why nobody run shows in Oregon for fear they would find out what they already know if they had them, which is why on the Olympic level and in sports where power and explosiveness are factors that do steroid test, the drug is so popular. On the Pillman situation and death, if there was regular drug testing in the WWF in 1997 as there had been years earlier, would Pillman be alive today? I think it's a very important question and one which nobody can give a definite answer. The cocaine should have come up in a drug test if he was tested regularly. Reportedly it didn't the one time he was tested. I'm not sure that would have saved his life, but would have alerted people to a potential problem, but then again, people did know there was a problem to an extent when he was crashing so many rental cars, including 3 in one 7-day period. The steroids DECA Durabolin in particular allegedly did show up when he was tested. He wasn't suspended for them at the time. The painkillers may have, but apparently none that he didn't have prescriptions for. The HGH is drug test proof, although both McMahon and Dr. Mauro de Pascal, who headed the WWF drug program years ago, both told me, McMahon on several occasions, even dating back to 1991 before de Pascal claimed to have invented the test a year later, claimed their test could detect HGH way back in 1992. If that was the case, how come Pillman used it daily for 18 months, was tested, and it didn't show up? Pillman Smith has collected several medical tests Pillman took over the last year of his life, about 5 in all. The WWF did not provide her with the results of his test taken about 1 month before his death, from insurance companies and whatever, and apparently none showed any existing heart problem. So the original story about a congenital heart problem being the cause because his father died in his early 50s doesn't appear to hold water. Stampede Wrestling ran its first major show at its old home, the Pavilion in Calgary, on April 2nd before a sellout of more than 1,800 fans for a television taping for the A Channel, an Alberta station. The new group, which has been running smaller shows for several weeks, is being run by Bruce and Ross Hart. There was a lot of local press for the first card and the crowd enthusiasm and heat was said to have been great. Most of the wrestlers weren't names. The only exceptions would be area vets Keith Hart and Hill Cuban Assassin, who got a huge babyface reaction, Ahim Albrecht, who worked as Brackus for WWF, Tatanka, and Curtis Thompson, Chip the Firebreaker from years back in WCW, who worked in the dying days of the old Stampede promotion, and came back under a hood as the Black Heart. The wrestlers were mainly Hart family or Leo Burke, who runs the Bret Hart Dojo, trainees, and most were able to put together solid 1 1/2 star level matches. A few were green. The best were said to be Greg Pavlik, who was compared with a young Chris Benoit or Dynamite Kid, and had a 3 1/2 stars match with a wrestler who went by the name of Dirty Dick Reigns. There was a famous 40s and 50s wrestler in Texas by that name. He's a former national amateur champion. The main event saw Tatanka beat Jason Neidhart, billed as a cousin, with Jim in the corner to set up Tatanka versus Jim on May 21st. Ed Whalen was there and was over more than anyone in the building except for Stu Hart, who was moving around very slowly. Whalen, one of the worst wrestling announcers ever but a total cult favorite, kind of like wrestling fans' reaction to Sid Vicious, since he's probably the most famous mainstream announcer in Alberta and is wrapping up his announcing career after 51 years this year, told his stories. Like the time he killed all of Abdullah the Butcher's heat about 30 years ago when Ed marked about his Butcher was out of control and took the hammer they ring the bell with and hit Butcher over the head with it several times and knocked him silly, and Butcher's gimmick was so destroyed about being KO'd by a TV announcer that he had to leave the territory for a long time, and he was the territory's biggest draw at the time. And got a huge pop during the Reigns vs. Pavlik match by teasing going after Reigns. Torquemada was brought in as a surprise to Whalen and came out with Whalen to do reprise of their famous shtick circa early 70s. 3 Calgary Stampeder football players, Marvin Pope, a former CFL All-Star, Jason Clement and Anthony McClanahan, who is recovering from neck surgery, wrestled, did a run-in and managed on the show respectively. This set up a football players versus muscleheads against Albrecht and Blackheart and a local guy named Gothic Knight, real name Chris King. They announced names of the members of the Stampede Wrestling Hall of Fame. Stomper, who worked there some 32 years ago, got a huge pop, and Stampede wrestlers who had passed away. Apparently it shocked many in attendance that Larry Cameron, who was the top heel in the area for about a year in the late 80s, had died. And in the Bruce Hart Creative Names department, in the program they listed a heel under the name Graham James, that is the name of a famous hockey coach in Canada who was heavily publicized last year for allegedly sexually molesting teenagers he coached. Nobody from that name appeared, and in his place was a wrestler billed as Dick Butkus Jr., the son of the football legend, with them goading the crowd to chant Little Dick at him. The other interesting name was H. Ivy Thompson. Stu got the biggest pop, a 4-minute standing ovation. The program noted that Stampede Wrestling was responsible for starting such wrestling stars as Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith, Owen Hart, Pillman Benoit, Jake Roberts, Junkyard Dog, Rick Martel, Chuck Rojo, not to mention the likes of Shinya Hashimoto, Kensuke Sasaki, Jushin Liger, Jim Neidhart, Hiroshi Hazi, Bret Hart, Billy Graham and others whose names weren't even listed, along with old-timers like Gene Kiniski, Archie Stomper Gouldy, Abdullah, the Scott Brothers, Bill Miller, Fritz von Erich, Wilbur Snyder, Joe Blanchard, Stan Stasiak, Larry Hennig, and Nick Bockwinkel. It appears there will be a promotional war in that area with a group called Can-Am Championship Wrestling headed by Steve Gillespie and Steve Wild. Power Pro packed the New Daisy Theater in Memphis, don't know the capacity, on April 2nd for the Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee vs. Fabulous Ones match, which the Fabs won when Lawler bumped into Stacy and Steve Kieran pinned him. The Fabs appeared at the TV show the next morning in a limo with Stacy. Dundee and Lawler did an interview and went at it with each other. Dundee blamed Lawler for worrying too much about Stacy, while Lawler told Dundee that whatever he's on, he needs to cut the dose. Lawler and Dundee wound up challenging the Fabs on television, with Lawler saying that they had both lost their hair and their guts. They announced on the show that Herb Welch had passed away during the week. Lawler and Dundee vs. Fabs wound up as a short pulled-apart brawl without even getting in the ring. Michael Hayes, who is still one of the best promo guys around, was at the studio as well and beat Mike Tierney via DQ due to outside interference. The rival Kick-Ass Wrestling announced tour shows for the first time and had Sid, Tracy Smothers, Tommy Rogers and J.C. Ice on the show this week. Pierre Roth Jr. won the Universal title from Ray Gonzalez on April 3rd in San German, Puerto Rico, one day after losing his mask, Puerto Rican style, as he had already lost his mask in Mexico last year to La Parca. There were 2 big shows over the weekend, as on April 3rd in Guaynabo, Puerto Rico, before 4,500 fans, Gonzalez and Pierre Roth had 3 different matches. The first match was for the Intercontinental title, which Pierre Roth won to retain the title. The second was for the Universal belt, which Gonzalez retained with a figure 4. The third fall was hair versus mask, and Gonzalez won via pinfall with a fisherman's suplex. The crowd cheered Pierre Roth wildly when he unmasked. Pierre Roth basically agreed to lose his mask in exchange for getting the Universal title the next night. The April 4th match was one fall with both the IC and Universal belts at stake, and Pierre Roth won, becoming a double champion. Shane Sewell won the vacant WWC TV title on April 3rd, beating Jim Steele. All Japan's Wolf Hockfield USA Today on March 23rd ran a really interesting column entitled, Forget Ethics, Bring on the Entertainment. It was a story about the University of Minnesota basketball scandal and the reaction to it, in particular Governor Ventura calling Walker Lundy, the editor of the St. Paul Pioneer Press, despicable for reporting on systematic academic cheating at the university on the eve of the tournament, which resulted in the university suspending 4 players and losing in the first round of the NCAA tournament. Ventura said the newspaper should have waited until after the tournament to print the story and that Lundy meant to take the pleasure of those young people who have worked so hard to get to the tournament and somehow try to spoil it for them. The newspaper received hundreds of letters and phone calls, few caring about the moral implication of a college basketball program that had an academic advisor write term papers for players to keep them eligible, although after the first deluge, about one-third of the letters became supportive. The USA Today column by Philip Myers said that delaying the story would amount to being a party to the university's corruption, but noted that due to the change in society that believes in entertainment above ethics, that Ventura's approval ratings are still the highest of any new governor in Minnesota since such polling began in 1947. Harry Fujiwara, Mr. Fuji, filed a $1.5 million lawsuit in U.S. District Court in Knoxville against Nintendo and THQ because in the WCW vs. NWO video game, there is a made-up wrestling personality called Master Fuji that uses the Japanese sleeper and the pile driver. Fuji was at times called Master Fuji in the WWF, and I do recall in the 70s in San Francisco that he used a Japanese sleeper as his finisher and may have used it in the WWF during all those tag title reigns with Tanaka and Saito. Anyway, the company that came up with the video game character is absolutely retarded to have not checked to see if a living wrestler resembled the made-up character. Vader had booked himself for shows on April 24th and April 25th in the Northeast, I believe for Mike O'Brien's Northeast Wrestling. This past week Vader called saying due to the proximity of the May 2nd Tokyo Dome show, that All Japan didn't want him doing the dates so he was canceling. Right after the conversation, the promotion put it out on its website the exact story rather than the all too typical advertising him for a few weeks to help move tickets and then announcing the switch at the last minute, if ever. In the latest on the NWA controversy over the belts, at the April 3rd NWA New England show in Milford, Connecticut, Tony Rumble's Brotherhood, Eric Spraxia, and Knuckles Nelson were still wrestling as NWA World Tag Team Champions and retained belts beating Public Enemy. The BBC in England continues working on a documentary about U.S. independent wrestling, including a scheduled filming at a New Dimension wrestling show in the Carolinas. With the popularity of pro wrestling spawning more indie-level wrestling than probably ever before, the indie horror stories, people running off with money, guys working and not being paid, guys showing up and finding out the people who booked them are frauds in some ways, is also increasing at a major level. We've had several stories in the past week alone. Jake Roberts, 43, was arrested and jailed outside of Athens, Georgia for being $21,000 behind on child support payments. Former All-Asian Tag Champs for All Japan, Billy Black and Joel Deaton got together on the NWA Georgia group to win its tag team titles on April 1st in Loganville, Georgia over Samoan Death Squad. Blaine DeSantis Pennsylvania Championship Wrestling is promoting a major show in mid-May, bringing in outside talent headlined by Two Cold Scorpio vs. Christopher Daniels vs. Reckless Youth in a triangle match plus Joe Legend, Zach Wilde and El Fuego from Canada and Venom Black from Tijuana. King Kong Bundy won the AWA title from Jon Stewart on March 31st in Oshkosh, Wisconsin to set up a rematch on the Superclass show in Bullhead, Arizona next week. Every independent group in Michigan is working together for a show on April 16th in Troy, Michigan at Athens High School as the Dan Curtis Memorial Show to benefit Ronald McDonald House of Detroit with a 60-man 3-ring battle royal which will include Insane Clown Posse, Ian Rotten, and Madman Pondo. For more info you can call 248-645-6666. Tommy Furo's ISBW is running April 16th in Newton, New Jersey at the high school with Bundy Bushwhackers, Devon Storm, Ace Darling, and John Cronus. April 17th in Harrison, New Jersey at the high school with Bundy, Iron Sheik, Darling, Storm, Christopher Daniels, and Cronus. April 24th in Boonton, New Jersey at the high school with Marty Jannetty, Storm, Cronus and Darling, and April 30th in Manville, New Jersey at the high school with Bundy, Sheik, Storm, Darling, Samu, and Cronus. Dick Bayer was named this past week as Citizen of the Year in his hometown of Akron, New York. All Pro Wrestling in Pinole, California on May 1st at the high school. That group held its annual awards banquet on April 3rd in Hayward, naming Michael Modest as both Wrestler of the Year and MVP, and named Suicide Kid vs. Christopher Daniels as Match of the Year, Modest and Tony Jones as Tag Team of the Year, and Vinny Massara as Rookie of the Year. MMA. We're going to make a minor change in groupings this week. Basically, from this point forward, Pancrase and USWF will both be listed here as opposed to other Japan notes and here and there as they have been. The idea is this section will be for shoot promotions, whether they call themselves Pro Wrestling, USWF, or are covered as Pro Wrestling, Pancrase, Pride and UFC in Japan. There is no 100% distinction because Pancrase, K1 and Pride have done worked matches with predetermined finishes in the past, and even USWF has had at least one in the past, and Pride surely will be doing it again in the future, and UFC has had suspicious matches but not finishes set up by the office. And we all know about people tanking matches in boxing, let alone whatever it was that Holyfield-Lewis fight really was, as at least with pro wrestling you know what the game is going in. And tennis, so to expect a one-on-one sport to be 100% shoot all the time is something that is a panacea more than a reality. Rings will continue to be categorized as pro wrestling since a large percentage of their matches are worked. Even though I'm a fan of rings, in many ways, their approach may be the most deceptive of all because you legitimately never know what you're getting when you buy your ticket until they go into the ring. And UFO is pro wrestling, just a different style. Besides Takada vs. Coleman, Inoue vs. Kerr and Belfort vs. Sakuraba, the remainder of the April 29th Pride show at Nagoya Rainbow Hall will be Akira Shoji vs. Igor Vovchanchyn, a Soviet fighter with a 24-1 MMA record and a recent win over Gary Goodridge. Satoshi Honma, who destroyed Yuhi Sano at the October 11th Tokyo Dome undercard, versus Francisco Bueno, a Brazilian of some reputation, and Ian Inoue Anson's younger brother versus Minoru Toyonaga, from the Takada Dojo, who has fought some shoot matches with Rings and Pride in the past. Takada and K1's Masaki Sadake are headed to Seattle to train for their respective fights. Tsuyoshi Kosaka and K1's Francisco Filio are already there training full-time under Maurice Smith. Besides training with Smith, there is a university state-of-the-art training center where they monitor everything to get athletes training at peak efficiency so they don't overtrain or undertrain. Takada left on April 6 and also said that he was planning on fighting Royce Gracie in October at the Tokyo Dome. The first major K1 show of the year will be April 25 at Yokohama Arena, with Goodridge of UFC fame making his kickboxing debut against Musashi, a mid-level Japanese fighter. Goodridge has told people that he's now with the K1 group and is done with UFC. It'll be interesting here, because Musashi should be too skilled for Goodridge even with a size difference, and Goodridge has never done kickboxing at anywhere near this level and Musashi has a lot of experience. Still, if Goodridge has a multi-fight deal, don't be surprised to see him go up. The top matches are Francisco Filio vs. Ernesto Hoost, Peter Aerts vs. Matt Skelton, Mike Bernardo vs. Sadake, and Andy Hug vs. Ray Cephos, so it's a fairly loaded show, all of the big four, Hoost, Aerts, Bernardo and Hug, and 7 of the 8 who went to the K1 Grand Prix finals last year, missing only injured Sam Greco, are on the show. There isn't much new on the May 7th UFC show. Last week the plan was for Pedro Rizzo vs. Trey Tulligman of Lions Den and Goodridge vs. Pete Williams, but the latter match is definitely out and I don't know if that will affect the former. The way the mindset seems to be in UFC is to put together low-budget shows and survive until, and if the cable breakthrough comes and they can attempt to reinvent themselves on the national stage again. The hope for plan is for the turnaround and first major show on September 17th out of Las Vegas, with Frank Shamrock, who is on the cover of the current Inside Kung Fu, versus Tito Ortiz as the main event, but it is far from a guarantee even getting into Nevada, as there isn't even a hearing set yet to apply, and as we mentioned there is the sticky point regarding striking on the ground. There is no guarantee getting into Nevada will mean the big cable companies will start carrying the show. There were 2 mid-level shows over the weekend. On April 2nd in Conoway, Quebec was a main event where Vladimir Matyushenko, who I believe is unbeaten, won over Travis Fulton, the world's most active fighter. He seems to fight just about every week or two, and Jeremy Horn won a tournament, winning his first round match, but his foe for the finals was injured, so he didn't fight a championship match. Sometime pro wrestler and valet Angel Amoroso lost a women's match via armbar to Zeev G. Zalico. Extreme Challenge ran April 2nd at the huge Market Square Arena in Indianapolis but only drew an estimated 1,500, and even that figure was heavily papered. Jeff Monson, coming off overpowering everyone and winning his weight class in Abu Dhabi in submissions against the toughest competition in the world, fought NHB style and lost to David Dodd in 40 seconds with an armbar, which again shows every time the rules change, it changes who wins, and also that this thing is very unpredictable. In a battle of UFC vets, Jason Godsey beat Zane Frazier with a choke, and local favorite Gary Myers, who was billed as having a 57-3-1 record, beat Keith Mielke with an equally suspicious 30-13 record, whose UFC experience was losing a dark match to unheralded Sam Adkins. Extreme Challenge actually has far more lax rules than UFC. The only things banned are biting, attacking the eyes, hair pulling, groin strikes and headbutts, but because it isn't UFC, faces far less political opposition, although it has faced some in its time, to running shows. Of course, the UFC name is also a draw because UFC has always done at least decent on pay-per-view, while virtually every other company that has tried doing the same basic thing, even with tons of advertising but without the UFC name, has died brutally. They ran a hugely successful event in Salt Lake City last year, which was a great show as well, and could you imagine what would happen if UFC tried to run Utah? Upcoming USWF dates are May 1st in Dumas, Texas, May 22nd in Amarillo, July 17th in Amarillo, October 2nd in Amarillo, and October 9th in Lubbock. ECW. It appears that Sid is done with the group. Sid no-showed the ECW Arena CyberSlam show, which was considered as one of the best shows in company history, on April 3rd. He missed his first flight, then upgraded his second flight to first class, and then didn't get on the flight. ECW announced he missed his plane. The next day, when asked by an indie intermediary about what happened, Sid first claimed he had a cold, but later in the conversation said that he just didn't feel like going. Paul Heyman said he talked to Sid the next day, and Sid said he no-showed to get Heyman's attention because he wanted the book, and Heyman said that Sid is done and won't be brought back unless he posts an appearance bond that he would forfeit in the event of a no-show. The May 16th pay-per-view show will be from the Mid-Hudson Civic Center in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is about a 3,000-seat building. With ECW having solidified its undercard with workers, they probably now, as funny as this sounds, have the most depth and the ability to put together the best actual in-ring pay-per-view shows in the country. WWF has the production, but the in-ring product lacks depth. WCW has the talent, but nobody is over except the older guys, and almost nobody cares about the younger guys with the talent. With Chris Candido potentially back, the elevation of Jerry Lynn and Super Crazy, adding Taka Michinoku and Mosco de la Merced, they've strengthened the base of the promotion greatly, and there is a constant at least attempt to get the new talent over. Sabu's mouth is still a mess, so he's basically for now just going to do run-ins and take the spot of Sid in that regard. New Jack's trial in the Eric Kulas case that was scheduled to start in Revere, Massachusetts on April 7th was postponed until late May. There are a lot of negotiations going on for new deals both when it comes to television, including a potential Nashville network deal for the Roller Jam Friday night time slot, but the way the costs and deal is set up would be prohibitive as it's currently structured, so major changes would have to be made before it's possible, and merchandising. At this point, no new deals are finalized. According to Heyman, ECW won't be financially out of hot water, although with the loan, they appear to be temporarily, until a video game deal is finalized with either Acclaim or Take-Two Interactive. The Buena Vista TV deal to underwrite the costs of the pay-per-view appear to have hit a snag. The deal isn't out of the water, but there appear to be higher-ups with cold feet about the deal, and it doesn't look promising to be in place in time for the May 16th pay-per-view show. There are also meetings about going through the WWF for licensing ventures. The April 3rd ECW Arena show drew a packed house estimated at about 1,200. It was down nearly 200 from the last show, so while it was full, it wasn't jammed full. Lynn beat Yoshihiro Tajiri in what was said to have been an excellent match. Lance Storm then came out, responding to Tommy Dreamer on television saying he was on the gas, with a supposed urine specimen saying he'd pass a drug test at any time. They wound up brawling and Dreamer poured the piss on the girl now known as Beulah. Nova and Chris Chetty beat Rod Price and Skull Von Crush in the weakest match on the show, ending when Von Crush turned on Price. Super Crazy beat Mosco in a really hot match with great crowd heat. Mosco looked horrible the first night in, but was better the second night and really good the third night according to reports. Michinoku returned and got a huge pop coming out since he wasn't advertised, and beat Papi Chulo with the Michinoku driver. There is a lot of speculation regarding the future of the Super Astros show, which is under contract to Univision through November. Since the Super Astros guys were supposed to be Univision exclusive, and now they are going to ECW, that may add to the speculation about its future. Anyway, the crowd was into the high spots, but after Lynn vs. Tajiri and Mosco vs. Crazy, they couldn't follow. Rob Van Dam beat the returning Too Cold Scorpio in a match said to be better than average, around the level of their pay-per-view match. Sabu did a run-in at the end. Scorpio was brought in only for one shot as a semi-name to put Van Dam over on television, but was in better shape than when last seen in WWF. Steve Corino came out and was mouthing off when Taz showed up. Corino faked appendicitis on both sides for more comedy, which brought out Candido and Tamisic, and Taz wound up destroying Candido with a choke into a suplex through a table. Candido wound up being carried out, and Taz beat him up while they took him out on a stretcher. Basically, the idea being presented on television is that it's Candido's blow-off. Candido before the match said that he never tapped out to Nubane or Somas. He was in good shape but was noticeably smaller. Sitch looked better than she looked when she was last in, but still looked like she had been through an ordeal. If they can stay clean, they'll be reinvented and put back into the mix. Shane Douglas beat Justin Credible in a bloodbath which was said to be both men's best match ever in ECW. After the match, Storm and Cyrus, Don Callis, did a run-in on Douglas and also left Dreamer laying. Finally they had a weapons brawl in a cage with the Dudleys and Mustafa over New Jack and Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney. Lots of juice. Mahoney threw fire, which is the first time since they nearly burned the building down that ECW has done fire at that building. Barbed wire and thumbtacks were used and Rotten took a body slam on thumbtacks and Mahoney took a messed up 3D for the finish on thumbtacks. After the match, New Jack jumped off the cage onto Mustafa through a table. Expect them to add a color commentator to the television show, with best bets being either Joel Gertner or Axel Rotten. Weekend house shows were April 1st in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which drew 1,500, and April 2nd in Edison, New Jersey, which drew 1,300. Expect a Taka vs. Crazy feud sooner than later. TV this week was mainly from Binghamton, New York last weekend. They also aired the dark match from the pay-per-view with Chetty and Nova beating During and Roadkill in a good match. This was better than most of the matches at all three PPVs in March, ending with a double splash off the top on Roadkill. Corino is going to get a big push doing a Stevie Richards type role. Dreamer vs. Storm was 4:30 of not much of a match, ending with a catfight spot, and then Credible interfered and hit Dreamer with the cane to lead to the pin. Credible and Storm should be tag champs because the tag belts mean nothing on Sabu and Van Dam right now, but since Sabu gets so hot about losing, I don't anticipate a change that quickly, although they have no purpose right now as champs. The show ended teasing a Lynn vs. Tracy Smothers match, but they only went 140 until Van Dam showed up, and they went off the air with Van Dam and Lynn squaring off again. Heyman has changed the Van Dam persona from being a good sport and wanting a match to prove who the better man is on pay-per-view, which apparently didn't get over. The fans booed the handshake after Sabu vs. Taz, and they had a good match as well, so he's back to doing his persona as Mr. Pay-Per-View, while trying to get Lynn over as the new effin' show. WCW. As it turns out, the pay-per-view lineup, which changed several times during the week, looks to be a four-way with Flair vs. Sting vs. Page vs. Hogan for the WCW title with no DQ and Savage as referee, Goldberg vs. Nash, Benoit and Malenko vs. Raven and Saturn, Hawk vs. Bigelow, Mysterio Jr. defending the Cruiserweight title against Kidman, Conan vs. Disco Inferno, and the U.S. title tourney finals with Scott Steiner vs. Booker T, and Blitzkrieg vs. Juventud Guerrera. There will be an open change on WCW Saturday night to go along with all the visual changes on Nitro. The changes in Nitro reminded me of putting a nice fresh coat of paint on a house that was just hit by a tornado. Apparently the deal with Scott Hall is that in about a month or two, he'll return on a 5-night-per-month schedule, Nitros and PPVs only. That's going to do more wonders for morale since he's making 7 figures and won't even be working house shows, while the guys who go on the road make 1/10 of that. And while he is respected as being a star, he's hardly a Hogan who has the track record to command a cush deal. But once they opened the door with it to Sting, the next tier of guys were bound to want the same deal, and with Hall, the last year has been such a disaster that this is probably the only way he can be used effectively. The announcing lineup will now be Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan for 3 hours on Nitro with Gene Okerlund and Ricky Rackman, who has been an absolute disaster thus far and was booed heavily in Las Vegas because he screwed up the first 900 number plug by not knowing the number and was exposed doing interviews. Mike Tenay and Larry Zbyszko for 2 hours on Thunder, Tenay and Scott Hudson on WCW Saturday night, and Schiavone and Heenan and Tenay on pay-per-view. On paper this sounded like moves in everyone's best interest, but after watching the first week of Nitro without Tenay and Heenan out there with his 20-minute act for 3 hours, and it was not for the better. The Nitro in Toronto, and in particular the Bret Hart angle taken in the Canadian media as a shoot, was actually a cover story the next day in the Toronto Sun. Hart underwent groin surgery on April 6th. Apparently the injury was far more serious than believed, but he's expected back in 6 to 8 weeks. The angle from Nitro hasn't been referred to since on TV because if they brought it up, it would give away that it's an angle. Of course, if they don't hype it to death with Hart out for 2 months, nobody is going to remember it or care. But WCW would rather try and fool people and not get something over than emphasize something other than Hogan's program and get anyone else over. Believe it or not, one of the reasons Ralphus was done away with was because of the feeling that his head was getting too big. Nitro on April 5th in Las Vegas drew a sellout 12,696, 9,384 paying $185,451. Crowd was dead most of the way and it was a poor show. Hawk beat Kendall Windham and Conan beat Lizmark Jr. I can't comment on these matches as a windstorm knocked the dish out of alignment. There were a bunch of skits with Flair, Nash and Hogan trying to build the idea that Nash and Hogan weren't trusting each other. Actually, they came across as insecure lovers. Tori Wilson wasn't on the show and Hogan kind of blew her off saying women like that were a dime a dozen. Medusa, Deborah Michelli Blackman, was backstage and either signed or is close to signing for a role doing a segment on Nitro as a nice-looking but classy woman. Medusa and Nash were tight from their WWF days, so that explains that one. It's doomed because Medusa's talking isn't that great, and because as bad as this is to say and I hate to write it, the truth is the male audience watching wrestling today does not want to see classy women, even if nice-looking, unless they are in a position where there is a chance they'll get their clothes ripped off. They did an angle, and did it in the first hour before Raw started for a change, with Flair, Hogan, Goldberg and Page to set up the four-way for the title as the main event. Steiner did an interview, mumbling over words left and right. He challenged DDP to a match but only if he puts his wife up for one night. Steiner beat Meng in 6:13 with a pin using the ropes after a low blow in a bad match said to be U.S. title tourney semifinal. Jim Duggan returned from cancer beating Lenny Lane with a knee drop in 4:28. The NWO Battle Royal was so much worse than you could ever imagine. The crowd went dead, like they had each individually had their hands covered in Novocaine. The wrestling was so bad that it was no worse than watching the women in WWF go at it, except nobody wanted to see these guys rip their clothes off. Stevie Ray won in 7:35, so he's the boss. The plan was for Ray to win and rename the Black and White into a new group that would be a modern version of the Black Panthers. Let's see, that's a 30-year-old term, and Adams and Horace are white. Mysterio Jr. and Kidman retained the tag titles in 9:47 over Raven and Saturn. Saturn used the DVD on Mysterio Jr., but Benoit and Malenko ran in and Benoit came off the top with a diving headbutt on Saturn and Mysterio Jr. was put on top by Malenko for the pin. Good match. Raven gave Mysterio Jr. one of the best low blows you'll ever see, and considering there are about 45 low blows every Monday, the competition for that one is fierce. Booker T beat Jericho via DQ in 3:46. Nick Patrick, back from knee surgery, was ref although none of that was acknowledged. Scott Steiner did a run-in for the DQ. It was really bad. Bagwell pinned Bigelow in 6:07. Dull match. Hawk and Chastity came out and Chastity sprayed Bigelow with a fire extinguisher. Bagwell was coughing bad from it and nearly fell off the ropes when he went to do his finisher, but did the buff blockbuster for the pin. Finally, with fans chanting "We want Sting," the show had been promoted as Sting doing an interview to explain where he stands. They did the Four Corners match. Crowd was dead. Match wasn't much. Everyone got to do their finishes but guys were saved. Goldberg speared everyone but Hogan kicked out of the pin. He used the jackhammer on Hogan. I'm presuming Goldberg was double-crossed on the spot here. The finish I'd bet was Nash to interfere and it'd be a no decision. But Nash was too slow, so Hogan had to kick out. The pops for Goldberg's spear were way down. Anyway, the match ended in 10:56 and Sting came down from the ceiling and pointed to the video wall. It was Savage narrating a piece saying there would be a four-way at the pay-per-view for the title with no DQ, and that Savage would be the ref. It was so contrived to have this video piece ready and left a bad taste about the match that had just ended. Thunder on April 1st in Richmond, Virginia drew 6,517 paying $127,435. The show also did a 3.08 rating, basically the same as its all-time low the week before, and a 5.0 share. This was basically everyone just goofing off because nobody cares. Raven and Saturn did an interview where they talked about being friends in high school and both liked Beulah McGillicuddy. Saturn said that was Tommy? Unfortunately, while Raven has a great comedic touch, Saturn has anything but, so the line didn't come off well. Norman Smiley beat Eric Watts in 6 minutes with the chicken wing. Smiley went to do the big wiggle, but the cameras cut to a crowd shot. Scott Steiner can say what he says on TV, but Smiley can't even do a lewd dance. Which is more gross, Smiley dancing or those ring outfits they used to have Giant run around in. Jericho talked to J.J. Dillon about getting back in the U.S. title tourney because Curt Hennig was injured, saying it was in the silent Brian McNeat, a mute Ontario wrestler from the 70s, clause in the rule book. Later he came to Flair and Flair let him back in. Dillon talked about that making no sense and how could we explain it, and Flair basically said who cares about anything making sense. Raven and Saturn beat Bobby Duncombe Jr. and Mike Enos in 6:10 when Raven pinned Enos with a DDT. Bad match. Duncombe hit Enos with a cowbell leading to the finish. Earlier in the match, Raven was KO'd by a kick that missed and the crowd turned on this match at that point. Jericho beat Chris Adams in 5:41 with a lion tamer. They brought up Adams' judo background and Tenay even knew that his brother Neil fought in the Olympics. Shivani asked which Olympics and Tenay knew 1984, the other was 1988, and in 1984. He won the silver medal which wasn't said. Adams delivered a super kick and Shivani noted that was from his judo background. So now we know Shivani doesn't know much about wrestling and knows nothing about judo. Flair brought in Ed Leslie, and called him Ed. He said in 30 days his contract expires and asked what his plans were after wrestling. Leslie looked shocked, I guess figuring with all the money this company wastes, that a guy who brings nothing to do the table would surely be renewed. I mean, the only guys WCW has ever fired were Sean Waltman, Vader and Steve Austin, and boy are their careers dead today. Anyway, Flair told Ed that he wanted him to wrestle Hogan, and was actually funny saying that deep down they both hate Hogan. When Jericho was brought in, Flair said he liked Jericho because Jericho grew up idolizing him and not Hogan. The material is unbelievably bad but somehow Flair pulled it off, although the ratings tell the important story. He told Ed that if he beat Hogan, he'd get his contract extended for 3 years at double the money, but if he lost, he's out of a job. The announcers were still playing dumb, as later they popped like they had no clue when it was announced Hogan vs. Disciple as the main event. Haven't we proven that announcers playing dumb doesn't help ratings? Meng and Jerry Flynn were to wrestle Hugh Morris and Barbarian, but they killed Flynn before the match. So we had a handicap match which went 12:35 before Flynn showed back up helping Meng, who used the Tongan death grip on Barbarian. Jimmy Hart hit Meng with a chair to break the hold but he wouldn't sell. They had this big video of Meng. Every time they give Meng a big push I ask why? So why? Hogan did an interview. This was Richmond so you knew it would get ugly because the people didn't like him. Actually it appeared about 20% of the fans did like it which shocked me. Flair came out to about 80% cheers and tried to insult everyone to turn them. He brought out Ed Leslie, calling him by that name, for the angle to set up the main event. Hogan made Flair look like a goof in his old stomping grounds, but after he ran everyone off and started cupping his ear, the fans booed him. That guaranteed those nasty Carolinas fans who were the first to boo Hogan years ago were going to eat it before the night was over. Malenko and Benoit beat Chavo Guerrero Jr. and Kaz Hayashi in a very good match when Malenko beat Kaz with the cloverleaf in 4:16. The announcer spent the entire match arguing with each other and paying no attention to the only decent match on the show. This was an angle to lead to the announcing changes and boy was it ever dumb. Saturn and Raven did a run-in and laid out Benoit and Malenko with Saturn jumping off the top rope outside onto Benoit on a table and the table didn't break which must have really hurt. Steiner was in the NWO dressing room talking about jumping Booker T, and Stevie Ray got mad saying they had a deal that his brother was off limits. This wound up with Hogan ordering a battle royal to find out the band leader. Page beat Horace with a diamond cutter in 9:54. Hogan beat Leslie via DQ when Flair interfered in 5:42. This match had no heat. Leslie even used the stunner, which got no pop, and Hogan got to do his Superman comeback after getting Austin's big move. Hogan was beating up Flair afterwards and then Arn, Malenko and Benoit all ran in, and Hogan beat all of them up at once. The fans were hating this a lot. As the show ended, Hogan was doing his 80s posing routine and the crowd was booing him out of the place. In matches for the April 7th show, Mysterio Jr. kept the Cruiserweight title beating Evan Karagias. There had been talk of giving Karagias and also Brad Armstrong pushes. La Cucaracha did an interview with Juventud Guerrera messing up English on purpose in the translation. This sets up the angle which aired the following Saturday where Conan unmasked him revealing Disco. Actually they should sell it like we'll finally after 33 years see what Mil Mascaras looks like without his mask. Wrath beat Damien, Hawk beat Mikey Whipwreck, Blitzkrieg beat Super Calo, and gave him a concussion doing the Sky Twister press and several days later Calo's face was still puffy but he was ready to work Nitro. Benoit DDQ Raven when Saturn and Malenko interfered and Booker T beat Jericho when Steiner interfered, but then Stevie Ray helped his brother. WCW Saturday Night on April 3rd did a 2.2 rating. WCW taped Saturday Night on March 30th in Kitchener, ONT before a sellout 4,735 paying $134,070 Canadian. They did programs where Rick Steiner beat David Finlay via DQ on the first taping to lead to a rematch which Steiner won with a pin in the second. Similar Flynn and Meng Morris and Barbarian leading to a rematch with Flynn and Meng winning. Funniest thing was Juvie doing translation for La Cucaracha. Conan, as Juvie was botching up the translations, told him that's atrocious. Nobody understands you. He said Juvie was a great wrestler but should stick to wrestling, and everyone cracked up. Connon ended up pulling off his mask as Disco. Final match of the taping saw Mysterio Jr. beat Guerrera in a very good match. Icon magazine did a 2-page condo with Hogan done months ago regarding him running for president. It was evident from the story that he was taking it seriously, and they weren't. Chris Kanyon has been vocal both backstage at the Toronto Nitro and on a wrestling radio show about how unhappy he is that wrestling was given the shaft in the Jesse Ventura movie, which will air in May, that he's a technical advisor to. In Toronto before Nitro, they did a spot where Kanyon turned himself face, and Niles Allen Stewart, the actor who plays Ventura in the movie, and also did the role plan for Goldberg on ER, came out as Jesse doing an angle where Ventura suffered a heart attack in a match, which actually never happened in real life. Kanyon was saying that the movie business was even more cutthroat than the wrestling business. Kevin Sullivan was actually fine the next day after people literally thought he could die before his eyes as his heart stopped beating backstage. Chris Benoit was on The Fan in Toronto and asked if he thought that there was a conspiracy to destroy the company from within, and he said, "It appears that way." He said that when he signed his new deal, he vowed he would never complain about the company again, but said that Bischoff hasn't delivered on the promises made when he signed. He said he's in wrestling for the money and that in 3 years he'll be 34 years old, be a free agent, and have a lot of money in the bank. He also said that Nash only pushes his friends. Canadian wrestlers Mike McFly, Greg Pavlik, Eric Fries, Todd Douglas, Gary Williams, Peter Smith and Scott D'Amore all had tryouts before the tapings in Toronto and Kitchener in empty arenas, with J.J. Dillon watching and Jimmy Hart taping the matches for The Office. Hart was scheduled to appear on later on April 8th. It was scary because it was taped a few weeks ago, and Hart talked about the Toronto angle before it was done, and you can imagine how scary this is in WCW. Apparently all is okay, except Hart may have talked about Goldberg being out with an injury, since Hart was told Goldberg would be out a few weeks and have knee surgery from the angle, which of course isn't what happened. Goldberg was in a lot of pain at Nitro due to a neck injury. He actually really speared the metal too hard and asked everyone to take care of him in the four-way, but the injury ended up getting aggravated, which is probably why at points in the match he seemed gun-shy. Tank Abbott has signed a contract, probably to at some point work with Goldberg. We always knew he'd wind up in pro wrestling. He does have charisma, but I'm betting strongly against this one. Hogan is booked with Jay Leno on April 9th, Page on May 4th, and Goldberg on May 19th. Goldberg should be on the cover of Entertainment Weekly this week. CNBC was scheduled to interview Bischoff for a piece on the wrestling business, although that could change. WCW was so unhappy with the ESPN show that they have closed their dressing rooms to reporters, and especially unhappy with Bischoff's performance. Bischoff was scheduled on Off the Record on March 29th and canceled at the last minute, saying he wasn't going to do any more interviews due to the ESPN piece, which hadn't even aired nor was even finished editing at the time he canceled, so he must have known he didn't do very well and didn't want to be put in that position again so quickly. Playboy is doing a wrestling story in the May issue. The next Rolling Stone has an article on Goldberg. E! Network is doing a 1-hour pro wrestling special. Goldberg took batting practice with Mark McGuire on April 3rd at RFK Stadium. Chad Brock, who did a few matches with WCW, has a single called Ordinary Life, which is number 7 on the current Billboard country music charts. Brock, 35, did 19 TV jobs for WCW last year after spending 2 years at the power plant, doing a gimmick as a country music singer before an injury sidelined him. He talked in an AP story that went nationally about wanting to get back in wrestling to help cross-promote his music. WCW took out a huge ad in USA Today on April 2nd with a new logo which read "Looks like something a bird left on the hood of my car," and never mentioned anything about wrestling, just listed April 5th, 8 p.m. with a TNT logo as well. You would think it was a movie with that name. Vampiro was apparently told by Kevin Nash that he wouldn't be appearing on Nitro or Thunder any longer. There was a lot of heat backstage because it was felt he didn't take any care of Juventud Guerrera in their Nitro match. House shows this past week were March 31st in Baltimore, drawing 10,797, paying $265,945. April 2nd in Fairfax, Virginia drew 7,581, paying $212,316, and April 3rd in Boston at the Fleet Center drew 10,280, paying $240,753, all with Flair Hogan on top, with Flair winning with a dusty finish as Charles Robinson DQ'd Hogan after a ref bump, but then him using the leg drop to pin Flair. Sting beat DDP on the show in Baltimore. Best matches in all 3 cities were Ray and Kidman beating Benoit and Malenko in tag title matches. Jericho has an ankle injury. That September 27th deal where Nitro and Raw will be going at it live literally next door to each other. The new Phillips Arena is next door to the Georgia Dome, is a war that WCW can't win. First of all, Raw is coming from the larger building, so they'll almost certainly outdraw Nitro, which is something they'll make a point of. Second, WCW has run big shows in Atlanta regularly at the Georgia Dome, so the arena will seem like a step down and there's no novelty to Nitro and Atlanta, but Raw has probably never been in Atlanta, and if it has, it hasn't been in this modern era, so it's a novelty as it has been years since WWF has run the market and WWF is the hotter commodity. Not to mention that with both coming from the same basic location, that WWF will come up with their dirty tricks and WCW never comes up with anything clever in response. Fitness model Trish Stratus, who was looking for work from WWF, was backstage at the Toronto Nitro also looking for work. Ted DiBiase showed up at the Vegas Nitro and did the Backstage Blast pay-per-view, and Rick Rude no-showed. They are contemplating a new slogan for WCW, "Shut up and wrestle." I'm not making that up. How about this one? WCW ordered a ton of new business cards, stationery, etc. with a new logo, and the address on all the cards was spelled Altana. Wrestlers are making bets backstage over who will be the first to trip and look stupid on the new set because the footing is said to be terrible. Everyone was overly careful coming down because nobody wanted to be the first. The WCW Latino show was moved this past week from Wednesday to Saturday from 8 to 9 p.m. on Telemundo, which means it went against the hottest Latino show in the country, Sábado El Gigante on Univision. In the ratings, Univision drew a 19.3 Latino audience while wrestling 5-days-old Nitro matches, generally but not always using Latin wrestlers and often as jobbers, drew a 1.6. Flair is about to be dropped from the Time Magazine Man of the Century Internet balloting, where he's currently in second place behind Jesus Christ. More than 20 million people have voted, making it the biggest web poll in history, with Flair getting more than 310,000 votes as of March 31st. Flair is being dropped because Janice Castro, the editor of Time.com, said his showing is due to unfair lobbying from wrestling websites, and Time has posted the following on the balloting: whimsical candidates and others who do not fall within the spirit of the title will not be counted. Jesus is about to go down as well, as religious organizations have gotten members to flood the ballot box, so to speak, and he had more than 890,000 votes. The two are still in the poll right now because Time.com is plotting an exit strategy, knowing all sorts of negative email will be heading its way by religious freaks and wrestling fans. However, with the God of Wrestling and the Son of God removed, the big winner in the poll appears to be the most ungodlike of all, Adolf Hitler, who would become the front runner. WWF. April 25th breakdown pay-per-view is Austin vs. Rock for the title with Shane McMahon as ref, Undertaker vs. Shamrock, Helmsley vs. X-Pac, Holly vs. Snow for the hardcore title, and probably Paul White vs. Mankind, although they'll need to do some sort of an angle on TV this week to pull that one off. Apparently at one point there was a plan for Austin vs. Mankind, and then later for Mankind vs. White, but that was before White didn't get over as a heel and they made the abrupt face turn because so much is invested in him and he needs to get over big, so they are trying to have Austin give him the rub. Mankind's knees are hurting pretty bad, but since the pay-per-view commercial was built around him, he figured this wasn't the time to rest up. His plan is to eventually rest up and get the knee fixed, but there is no timetable for when he's going to take the downtime. He was given the European tour off but will be back in the ring this coming weekend. The UPN special from 8 to 10 p.m. on April 29th won't be a women's only special. There will apparently be a decent amount of women's stuff, but they're going to use the men to draw the rating and expose the women to that audience. While it's still not a 100% definite, the plan seems to be to run a 1-hour show starting at 9 p.m. starting in August, on either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, as that isn't definitive. WWF will be introducing several new women characters on Raw to get them ready for the spin-off show. Kerwin Silfies, who has been the director of the WWF television shows dating back to the early 80s, suffered a heart attack last week and is on the mend. A biography of Mick Foley is being written by Lusa Hadi. Former WWF VP Basil DeVito is talking about writing a book on the marketing of the WWF. Sean Stasiak should be starting in about 6 weeks as the love slave for PMS. He's currently undergoing a hair transplant before he comes in. Another wrestler who is gaining experience in Memphis, Matt Bloom, who worked as Baldo, should be starting at about the same time. Originally the idea was for him to come in as George Steele Jr., since he does look like a much larger version at 6'6.5" and 370 pounds, but there is also talk of not saddling him with that gimmick. One of the headbangers, I believe Thrasher Glenn Ruth, will be doing the Beaver Cleavage gimmick, but we don't know who will play the mother, Mrs. Cleavage. The other will be doing an evil clown a la Doink, and Bruce Pritchard may wind up managing him, but not in the Brother Love character. Bart Gunn suffered a concussion from the KO punch by Butterbean and was pretty well disoriented even the next day. There are no return dates set for Butterbean, nor any talk of future Brawl for Alls. In hindsight, that whole Brawl for All turned into a major flop. Savio Vega suffered a neck injury he still hasn't recovered from. Steve Williams, who was brought in with the idea of being a top contender for the title, was injured and out for months, and his stock dropped to the point he's involved in a feud with prelim guys like Holly and Snow. Bart Gunn, who came out of it as the star, was never pushed, went to Japan, and when he finally came back, his tough guy reputation was destroyed in seconds by someone who was really only a gimmick boxer, but he was a real pro boxer, and as it showed, that's a world of difference from knocking out pro wrestlers. So when all was said and done, WWF got nothing out of it and got nobody over as a legit tough guy from it. WWF officials must have thought Gunn would win, since within boxing circles Butterbean is considered a joke, and the match, despite its spectacular conclusion, has never been mentioned on WWF television. After the match, WWF officials did vaguely talk with Butterbean about being a pro wrestler once his boxing career is over, but not about doing a Brawl for All shoot fight against any of its wrestlers. The WWF CD was at number 24 on the charts last week with 47,051 buys, while Slammin' Wrestling Hits, which was supposed to be pulled from the marketplace, remained at number 176 with 7,671 buys. Fabulous Moolah was backstage at Mania. Steve Austin's phone company commercial with D'Lo Brown started airing this past week. Steven Regal was let go. He'd been in drug rehab the past few months and was only 3 weeks from completion and was allowed to go home for a weekend and didn't make it. Shawn Michaels' promo delivered at Mania was not what it was supposed to be. Not sure of how it was supposed to be different, but there was heat about it, and that will partially explain why he wasn't at TVs the next 2 nights. Michaels also was married on April 1st in Las Vegas to Whisper of the Nitro Girls. The two had only known each other for a few weeks. Michaels had just had an engagement broken off a few months back. Legendary photographer Annie Leibovitz shot the Steve Austin milk commercials. Esquire magazine is doing a feature on Mick Foley and his brother, and MSNBC is planning a feature on Vince McMahon. Mark Canterbury, Savio Vega, Mark Henry, Carl Pierre, Ouellette and Solofa Fatu are coming in for the April training camp to evaluate their progress in injury recovery. Ouellette and Fatu are fine, those two are more along the lines of trying to come up with ideas to use them. Canterbury is said to have dropped considerable weight. The only American show of the week was the March 30th tapings at the Nassau Coliseum, which drew a sellout of 12,666, paying $313,328 and another $95,396 in merchandise, or $7.53 per head. After that, they had a tour with 1 show in Germany and 3 in England. April 1st in Oberhausen, Germany was the only non-sellout, doing 7,048, paying $285,135 in US dollars. April 2nd in Sheffield, England drew a sellout 12,744, paying $417,495. April 3rd in Newcastle, England drew a sellout 10,669, paying $342,990. And April 4th in Birmingham, England drew a sellout 12,236, paying $453,124. We don't have the merchandise figures for those shows. The top match was Austin vs. Rock the first 2 nights, Austin vs. Bossman the 3rd night in Austin, and White vs. Rock and Shamrock on the final night. The Forbes magazine wrestling story in the March 22nd issue by Peter Kafka basically was headlined about how pro wrestlers have no leverage when it comes to their paychecks. It was a very interesting article talking about how pro wrestlers were the very antithesis of celebrities in almost every other entertainment form, in that the performer owns the value of his celebrityhood, while in wrestling the performers don't own anything. The story noted that pro wrestlers get 15% of the revenue the business generates as compared with 48% for NBA players, but the article noted the wrestlers of today still have it better than the stars of the past. It quoted Ken Patera, who was a major star from 1972 to 1988, working for virtually every major office at one time or another, as saying at his peak he earned $140,000 per year, but after expenses, his best year only netted $42,000. Weekend ratings for April 3rd and 4th saw Livewire at 1.9, Superstars at 1.8 and Heat at 3.66. All numbers, Heat in particular, were substantially down from what the shows had been delivering, and there were no Academy Awards or NCAA basketball games to use as an excuse. Both Heat and Raw this week were uncharacteristically boring, with all the emphasis on the fantasy-oriented Undertaker angle. In notes from the Heat show, Shane McMahon was no longer announcing, and the team this week was Michael Cole and Kevin Kelly. Tori was no longer wearing her Naked Woman ring outfit. Val Venus blew off Ryan Shamrock again. How come Droz is no longer a drug dealer? Shouldn't he be like The Godfather, offering coke to the wrestlers before the matches so they don't fight him? Or is that not cool? They clearly were teasing on both shows a split between both Vince and Shane, and also Vince and Stephanie, who was very good in her role. Whenever Stephanie wanted to talk, Vince would shut her up. Raw featured a parental warning graphic about some of the material on the show being unsuitable for children before the show started. The match where X-Pac and Kane won the tag titles from Hart and Jarrett was really hot. But I guess that's to be expected since Hart is very good in the ring. Jarrett is good, and X-Pac, who worked 90% of the match for his team, is the best worker in the company. Originally the plan was to hold Austin vs. Rock off until SummerSlam, but uncharacteristically, they went with a WrestleMania rematch on the first pay-per-view after the show. The impression I've been given is they recognize they can't keep Rock as a heel for much longer, so they'll probably be shooting the angle within the next month or two, so there is no point in holding the match off. Obviously, Raw is also going to have a new set next week as Austin and White destroy the Titantron at the end of the show. The idea is that Shane put the belt on the screen, although Stephanie thought it was a bad idea to provoke Austin and Vince didn't think it was a good idea. But with Vince busy caring about Stephanie, Shane kept putting it up, and finally Austin said it was going to cost Vince a lot of money and they destroyed the screen. Before the Ryan Shamrock crucifixion, the Ministry all attacked Ken and put him in the trunk of a car and drove him off. The rest of the corporation wouldn't help Ken, and Shane and Rock were telling the others, who wanted to help, not to do so because it might be a trap. A clarification on the story of off-the-record host Michael Landsberg working for WWF. Landsberg had a tryout with the WWF many weeks back. They left it as both had things on their agenda and would talk again after WrestleMania, both about possibly announcing and also about possibly producing a 30-minute syndicated show. On the WWF website, Vince McMahon called Phil Mushnick a liar, a coward and gutless for not showing up on the Fox News Network show a few weeks back, so I guess Jim Byrne's statement about Mushnick being called a liar and coward by McMahon on the air after the facts of the situation came out was now meant for things in the past and not on that day was still lost on McMahon. The website did leave out all the minor details as to why Mushnick wasn't on, and after all this still challenged him again to meet McMahon face to face. Brooklyn Brawler, Steve Lombardi, was brought in for the European tour and worked the openers and angles set up by Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe, who introduced him as one of the all-time greats, having headlined shows in Madison Square Garden. After he'd then lose the openers, they would fire him from the corporation. Earl Hebner also got elaborate intros as the legendary Earl Hebner when he'd come out to ref. Prince Nazim Hamed was at the show in Sheffield, while Dorian Yates, the multi-time Mr. Olympia winner, was in the front row at the show in Birmingham, I believe as a guest of Shamrock, which is Yates' home. A lot of the wrestlers were playing to Yates doing muscle poses. In the UK on March 19th, Raw had 320,000 viewers to Nitro's 290,000, so it's a lot closer there than here. Schedule for major shows for the summer: June 6th Heat tapings at Nassau Coliseum, June 7th Raw in Boston and June 8th Raw in Worcester, June 11th House Show in Detroit, June 12th House Show in Pittsburgh, June 13th House Show in Cleveland, June 18th House Show in Richmond, June 20th Heat in Nashville, June 21st Raw in Memphis, June 26th House Show in Madison Square Garden, June 27th King of the Ring in Greensboro, June 28th Raw in Charlotte, June 29th Raw in Fayetteville, July 9th House Show in Philadelphia, July 11th Heat in Indianapolis, July 12th Raw in Louisville, July 13th Raw in Lexington, July 16th House Show in San Jose, July 17th House Show in Anaheim, July 23rd House Show in Providence, July 24th House Show in Toronto Sky Dome, July 25th Pay-Per-View in Buffalo, July 26th Raw in Cleveland, July 27th Raw in Columbus, Ohio, July 31st House Show at the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey, August 1st House Show in Baltimore, August 6th House Show in Washington, D.C., August 7th House Show in Pittsburgh, August 8th Heat in Detroit, August 9th Raw in Chicago, August 10th Raw in Milwaukee, August 12th House Show in Dallas, August 13th House Show in Houston, August 14th House Show in St. Louis, August 22nd SummerSlam in Minneapolis at Target Center, August 23rd Raw in Iowa City, August 24th Raw in Kansas City, August 27th House Show in Philadelphia, and August 28th House Show in Madison Square Garden. The readers' pages. Outside the Lines.
Just watched ESPN's Outside the Lines and overall was very impressed.
I thought it was very professional and ESPN gives all of their pieces credibility.
I'd be interested to hear what casual fans and non-fans thought of the show.
I couldn't help but notice a great deal of hypocrisy on several people's part. I know this probably isn't a news flash in wrestling, but here are some of my observations. I can somewhat agree with Vince McMahon saying that if parents don't approve of the WWF, change the channel. But the fact their marketing is aimed directly at children is disturbing. Buff Bagwell denying he is on the gas while sitting there with no shirt on was hilarious. They should have shown a photo of him from a few months ago and compared it with now. I realize he is coming off a major injury, but come on. More seriously, if Phil Mushnick is so vehemently opposed to wrestling and especially Vince McMahon, how can he in good conscience continue to be an employee of a company that has twice featured wrestlers on its cover?
Aren't those some of TV Guide's most successful issues ever? If Mushnick had a shred of integrity or was committed to his principles, he'd resign from TV Guide and sell his stock in the company.
To me, he was the biggest hypocrite of all, although the average viewer would never pick up on that. Dave Gillespie. Richmond, Texas. DM Mushnick is not vehemently opposed to wrestling. Mushnick has written numerous negative columns about George Steinbrenner, but that doesn't make him vehemently opposed to baseball, or even shipbuilding for that matter. That was a storyline created on Raw by Jim Cornette, who in his defense, may not have known any better. He is vehemently opposed, as I am, to the dangerous excesses within wrestling that have led to such a high preponderance of early deaths and to its ramifications because of its marketing appeal to young children given its adult storylines. Super Astros. I've watched Super Astros from the beginning and I'm very pleased. This show is far better than anything WWF or WCW has to offer. I don't speak Spanish, so the commentary is useless to me. But at least Carlos and Hugo aren't made out to be the stars of the show. Maria Felipe seems pretty good.
She's far better than Missy Hyde ever was and has great facial expressions.
Maybe the stars are new to most of us, but good wrestling is still good wrestling.
Jesus Castillo and Miguel Perez are finally getting a decent push.
Armando Fernandez is pretty impressive. Apollo Dantes has great presence. He doesn't show much, but he's good in his role. The minis are great. My favorite so far is Papi Chulo. I feel he'll be the star if he's pushed right. This show is 30 minutes of entertainment. Maybe there are some screwjob finishes, but at least it doesn't insult my intelligence like WCW, and it isn't full of pornography like WWF and ECW. Now I just wish they'd cancel it so it can end with me having nothing but good memories of it before they turn it into another segment of trash TV. Bobby Yates.
Randleman, North Carolina.
Mexico.
I want to emphasize that business is booming all over Mexico.
It is rare when either AAA or CMLL get less than an 85% house at any major show these days.
The economy has improved and the peso rate has improved 10% in the last 4 months.
So everyone is making more money in real terms.
This continues to be the best year of the decade for 2 promotions.
The AAA was red hot in 1994 and the UO was red hot in 1990. It was CMLL's best first quarter since the 80s. One shouldn't underestimate this accomplishment.
To run 3 major shows a week in this day and age at arenas that are 3 miles apart in the same city for 43 straight years and to be drawing 85% and up houses every week is significant. Imagine the WWF running Madison Square Garden once a week and the Paramount twice a week every week just this year, their hottest year, let alone having done it for 43 straight years and with only 90 to 120 minutes of television per week. Imagine New Japan or All Japan running Budokan every Friday night and Korakuen Hall twice every week, and you can see how difficult this is. Add the factor of the economy in Mexico as opposed to United States and Japan. Without overstating things, it is fair to say CMLL has had a remarkable run and a world-class year. AAA rises and falls on Antonio Pena's creativity since it is so gimmick-oriented these days. But he varies who he pushes in his arenas well enough, and knows how to create stars on television that even with a lot of raw and poor workers he still draws great guns. In certain ways it may be that for the first quarter of the year the best wrestling on the planet has been the IWRG guys. Steve Dr. Lucha Sims. Chula Vista, California. UFC, in the interest of preserving your integrity as a journalist, I think you should disclose whether or not you got paid by Semaphore Entertainment Group for your UFC judging duties. If you are being compensated by them for your work, it does compromise your ability to cover the card fairly. Michael Barrett. Toronto, Ontario. Response from Dave Meltzer: I wasn't paid for judging. If getting paid for judging were to compromise my ability to cover shows fairly,
And I agree with that and would have never taken money for judging for that very reason. It would also be better if everyone else who claims to be a journalist is held to the same standards.
The longer you're around, the longer you realize that very few people are uncompromised, and that today, for better or worse, very few people care if they are or aren't. Rickson Gracie.
I attend college at UNC Chapel Hill.
There is a 21-year-old Brazilian in my dorm who laughs at the fact that I enjoy pro wrestling.
He makes fun of me and says that none of the fake wrestlers could hold a candle next to his famed national hero Rickson Gracie.
I've watched tapes of Rickson Gracie, but have never heard you mention him.
Rickson claims to be undefeated.
Is he legit? Has he ever faced anyone with a rep?
Daniel Whitman. Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Response from Dave Meltzer. We've written about Rickson Gracie regularly for the past 5 years since he's played a major role in the evolution of Japanese pro wrestling and shooting and headlined 2 major Tokyo Dome shows against Nobuhiko Takada. Gracie is undefeated and I'm sure in his prime with the knowledge he had would have been a very tough man to beat at that time. All shoot fighting legends pre-1996 are largely myth anyway because there were no venues for the top guys to fight each other and the skills involved were largely secretive as compared with today. As far as ever facing anyone with a rep, he beat Hugo Duarte, although so did Tank Abbott, and Duarte did nothing but run away against Mark Kerr. He beat Takada twice, but Takada was talented at pro wrestler. The true shoot fighters in Beverly Hills that were training him and trained alongside him had no respect for his being a real fighter. Gracie won 2 tournaments in Japan, but they were loaded with people who ever beat anybody since that time. He beat Yoshihisa Yamamoto in 21 minutes in Yamamoto's first ever fight of that style, but Yamamoto is not even considered one of the top 2 shooters in his rings organization. He did tap out Mark Schultz, an Olympic gold medal winning wrestler, twice a few years back, in a dojo match with no striking allowed, but Schultz had absolutely no experience in submissions going and so as great an athlete as he is, he was playing somebody else's game.
Gracie also literally beat the hell out of Yoji Anjo. It could basically be called an unsanctioned street fight.
I don't believe Gracie could beat the top fighters today both because of the reality of his own advancing age and because of the advancement of the style, but we'll never know for sure because he's never going to risk his reputation and myth against anyone real. American pro wrestling is entertainment and shouldn't be confused or compared with real wrestling, shoot fighting or MMA on the professional level any more than the Harlem Globetrotters should be compared with last season's Chicago Bulls or Sylvester Stallone with Roy Jones Jr. in a boxing match. I'd suspect very few pro wrestlers of today would have the knowledge or experience to beat Gracie in a true shoot, but that isn't their game, and there are a few like Ken Shamrock or Tsuyoshi Kosaka that would probably give Rickson Gracie a very tough night. Renegade?
Back in May 1995, at the WCW Worldwide tapings, instead of putting Renegade over, didn't Steve Austin refuse? Leading to an awful Renegade vs. Tex Slazenger match?
If I remember right, wasn't that incident the catalyst for sending Austin into the WCW doghouse, ending up when he was fired over the phone by Eric Bischoff?
I believe from there Austin went to ECW for a brief stint, where his mic work as superstar Steve Austin laid the groundwork for what would ultimately evolve into Stone Cold.
In a roundabout way, perhaps Richard Wilson really did leave a mark on the industry. Harry Simon. Las Vegas, Nevada. Response from Dave Meltzer.
On May 10, 1995 in Orlando, Austin was supposed to do a job for Renegade but refused, and there was some concern at the time that the refusal would have been job-threatening.
It turned out it wasn't at the time, but the management at the time along with Ric Flair and Arn Anderson in particular attempted to talk him into doing it and he still refused, and there was a decent amount of sentiment backing him up at the time from other wrestlers as usually people who refuse to do jobs aren't in most cases looked upon that fondly by the other wrestlers.
That incident may have been a small part of the end result of Austin being fired, but it probably wasn't a major reason since Bischoff has always claimed Austin was fired because he was constantly injured, bad knee and torn tricep, and there was concern in the company about them getting a straight answer of the severity of the injuries and when he would return from them.
WCW. I sucked it up and watched Nitro. For all their money, their unprofessionalism is amazing. They spent tons to bring in Vampiro. This is a guy with tremendous potential as a heavyweight.
He has some in-ring skills, charisma that rivals Sting and if fresh. And they jobbed him to Juventud Guerrera, a cruiserweight, just because Guerrera bitched to Kevin Nash about Vampiro using his finisher and bugged Nash so much that Nash asked Vampiro to put him over.
Losses on television still mean something. Where would Goldberg be if he had done a job for Kidman in his third television match? This is unprofessional.
Even when they have good matches, I have a hard time watching WCW.
This is a company that can't see the value of a Bret Hart, of a Conan, or even of a Mike Tenay. it didn't until recently even see the value of Ric Flair. To me, WCW is a cancer that deforms everything it touches, and that has included New Japan Pro Wrestling and Mexican wrestling. It has the greatest financial backing of any company in history, the biggest talent pool in history, and is owned by the television channel. And they're still stinking the place out. I'm so glad Vince is kicking their ass, because they deserve it. They couldn't turn Ric Flair if he raped Hulk Hogan's grandmother on television. I know Flair, all he's done and all the support he has, but I have trouble with him being the greatest wrestler of all time when his offense is so weak that he can't work as a face against Hogan. It would be fun to have a vote on the wrestler of the century next year. I know that Flair would win and that Sabu would get votes, but it would be interesting to go over the qualifications of the candidates. I would go with Jim Londos and Frank Gotch. It might also be interesting to vote for the best wrestler of every decade. It might stimulate some interesting letters from the historians of the wrestling world, all 5 of them. All the speculation of Ric Flair's title reigns is interesting. Let's look at Lou Thesz using the same criteria. 1 December 29, 1937, defeats Everett Marshall for NWA title in St. Louis via count out. 2 January 25, 1938, awarded AWA title when Yvonne Robert refuses to meet him in Boston. 3 February 23, 1939, pins Everett Marshall for National Wrestling Association title in St. Louis. 4 June 12, 1940, pins Leo Numa in Montreal for Montreal World title. 5 September 11, 1946, pins Bobby Manigoff in Montreal for Montreal World title. 6 April 16, 1947, beat Bobby Manigoff in Montreal for Montreal World title. 7 April 25, 1947, beats Whipper Billy Watson in St. Louis for National Wrestling Association title, holds NWA and AWA titles. 8 July 20, 1948, beats Bill Longson in Indianapolis for National Wrestling Association title. Thesz beat Enrique Torres, world champion in California, on September 24, 1948 and October 9, 1948 in St. Louis and 9 other times in 1949 but doesn't count because Torres' title wasn't at stake. 9 November 25, 1949, awarded National Wrestling Alliance World title when Orville Brown is injured in auto accident and can't appear for title unification match. July 29, 1950, Thesz beat Gorgeous George, AWA World Champion, in Chicago, but this doesn't count because only Thesz' title was at stake. George was counted out. 10 May 21, 1952, defeated Baron Leone in Los Angeles for the California version of the world title. March 27, 1953, Thesz beat Montreal World Champion Vern Gagne in St. Louis, but only Thesz' title was at stake. Thesz also beat Montreal World Champion Killer Kowalski on September 10, 1953 in Toledo and November 21, 1953 in Milwaukee, but in both cases only Thesz' NWA title was at stake. 11 July 15, 1955, Thesz beat Leo Nomellini in St. Louis. Nomellini had been recognized in some places as world champion after beating Thesz via DQ in San Francisco. October 28, 1955, defeated Montreal World Champion Don Leo Jonathan in Chicago. Only Thesz' title was at stake. 12 November 9, 1956, defeated Watson in St. Louis to win NWA title. 13 July 24, 1957, Thesz beats Edward Carpentier in Montreal via DQ to win the NWA title. Later the NWA claimed Carpentier never had the title in the first place, but in Chicago, Montreal, and every newsstand magazine at the time and even Sam Mushnick at the time said he did. 14 January 24, 1963, beat Buddy Rogers in Toronto for NWA title. 15 June 7, 1963, beat Tarzan Tyler in Atlanta to win NAWA title in a title unification match. 16 September 7, 1964, beat Carl Gotch in Columbus, Ohio to win AWA title in another title unification match. Thesz beat WWA champion Dick the Bruiser on 10 occasions in 1965, however Bruiser's title was never at stake. September 11, 1965, beat WWA Indiana version champion Gene Kiniski in Vancouver, BC, however only Thesz' title was at stake. 17 October 14, 1966, beat Buddy Austin in Los Angeles for WWA California version world title. 18 January 1968, recognized as first TWWA champion in Japan. 19 August 1977, recognized as first UA champion in Mexico. So what's my point in all of this? I don't know. But I would like to remind everyone that Thesz never did a job for Eric Bischoff. Is there any correlation between WCW going to a tape-delayed show on the West Coast in order to go head-to-head with Raw and their ratings drop?
A thing to be remembered is that WCW was the one who forced the fans on the West Coast to make a choice on Monday nights.
They shouldn't be upset that the fans picked the major league company. Steve Yohei. Montebello, California. Response from Dave Meltzer.
Let me try for each decade. 1900 to 1909 Gotch, 1910 to 1919, I have no idea, maybe Earl Caddick or Gotch again, although Gotch didn't do much after 1913, 1920 to 1929, Strangler Lewis was the biggest star, but my guess is he wasn't the most entertaining performer in the ring.
1930 to 39 Jim Londos, certainly if you consider success and drawing power. 1940 to 49, Luthez. 1950 to 59, I'd probably go with Thez again because he went all over the world and held the biggest belt for almost the entire decade, but it's a tough call with Buddy Rogers and Reed Keatosen in the same decade.
1960 to 69, hard to pick one that stands out. Sammartino is the first that comes to mind, but it's hard to rate him above Baba since Baba was far bigger in his culture than Sammartino was in his.
Really, Kinniski blew both of them away inside the ring but wasn't as big a star as either. 1970 to 79, I'd say Inoki was the biggest star of the decade for sure, except for maybe Andre.
Actually, Andre on an international basis was far bigger than Inoki, but Andre was never a national cultural hero anywhere like Inoki still is.
Dory Funk Jr., Mil Mascaras and Harley Race should be there as well.
When it comes to Andre and Dusty, if we're doing gimmick guys who drew, Gorgeous George should win for the 50s then, 1980 to 89, Flair.
Nobody else is even close, although the biggest star of the decade was Hogan 1990 to 99, Bissau, although Liger deserves mention as well. I don't think there is any correlation between Nitro going tape delayed 3 hours later on the West Coast and the ratings lead changing. Raw was starting to beat Nitro every week before TNT went to a separate West Coast feed.
The folks at WCW believed that once Nitro was moved to primetime on the West Coast, that Nitro would be back on top, and it didn't prove to be the case. Actually, Raw had the advantage because of the better West Coast time slot during the period.